Ever heard a child say a name and known, somehow, before you could explain it to yourself, that the name did not belong to the person he was pointing at? Ever stood on a road at first light and watched somebody walk toward you out of the fog and felt your body decide something about them a full 10 seconds before your mind caught up? Ever had a place look back at you? Because that is where this one starts. On a road. In the fog. In October of 1907. In the deep folded country of Newton County, Arkansas, where the hills do not rise so much as the ground falls away between them, and a man can stand on a ridge and look down into a hollow he has known his whole life, and still not be able to say, honestly, how deep it goes. A boy came walking up out of one of those hollows that morning. He was 9 years old. He was barefoot, and his feet were cut, and he had been walking for something close to 11 miles. And when the sheriff of Newton County finally got him warm and got him fed and got him to speak, the boy told him a thing about his older brother that the sheriff wrote down in his daybook in a hand that got smaller and tighter as it went, the way a man's hand does when he does not want the words to be as big as they are. I have read that entry. I will give it to you word for word before this is over, but not yet. A note before I begin. If this is the kind of case you would want 10 of, and not one told in full, in the dark, in a voice made for it there is a collection, What the Hollows Keep. 10 cases out of 10 counties across 5 states. 1871 to 1954. Every one of them a place that people walked into and did not walk out of the same, and every one of them signed off by the law with the wrong word on the paper. 9 hours, start to finish, for the nights when one is not enough. The link is down in the description and pinned at the top of the comments. And before I go on, tell me where you are watching this from. Put it in the comments. I want to see how far this one reaches tonight. And if you have not already, hit subscribe. It is free, and it means the next one finds you. Now then, let me tell you about Newton County. It sits in the north center of Arkansas, up in the Boston Mountains, which are not mountains in the way a Coloradan would use the word, but are older than the Rockies by a margin that does not really fit in a person's head. The Ozark Plateau is not a range that was pushed up. It is a flat thing that was cut down. Water did it. Water spent 250 million years dragging its fingernails through limestone and sandstone and dolomite, and what it left behind is a country of hollows, narrow, steep-sided, wooded valleys that branch and branch and branch again, like the veins on the back of an old man's hand. In 1907, Newton County had 8,400 and some people in it, spread over 823 square miles. That is roughly 10 people to the square mile, and the 10 were not spread evenly. They clustered along the creeks and the few wagon roads. There was no railroad in the county. There never has been. To this day, there is not 1 mile of railroad track in Newton County, Arkansas, and that is not a small fact. It is the whole reason the county stayed the way it stayed. Jasper was the county seat. It had a courthouse, a jail, 2 general stores, a blacksmith, a hotel with 6 rooms, and a population you could count without much trouble on a Sunday. The Buffalo River ran through the county from west to east, and along it and up every feeder creek that fed it, there were farms 40 acres, 80 acres, 160 cut out of the timber by people who had come down out of Tennessee and Kentucky and North Carolina in the 1830s and 40s, and had stayed because the ground was cheap and because nobody bothered them there. That is the important part. Nobody bothered them there. When you have a place where the law is 1 man and 2 deputies covering 800 square miles of ground that a horse cannot cross in a straight line, you develop a different relationship with what is true. Things that happen in the hollows stay in the hollows, not because anyone conspires. Because there is no mechanism. A family loses somebody in 1894, and there is no telephone to call, and the nearest neighbor is 4 miles by the ridge and 11 miles by the road. and by the time word gets to Jasper, it is a rumor about a rumor, and the sheriff has 3 other things in front of him that involve living people. So the hollows kept their own accounts. And there is one hollow in the southeast quarter of Newton County that kept more than most. On the county survey maps of that period, it is unnamed. It shows up as an unlabeled drainage running roughly north-northeast off the divide, joining a creek that joins the Buffalo. The survey crew that ran the lines in 1888 left it blank, which by itself is not unusual. Plenty of small drainages went unnamed. What is unusual is that on the 1888 plat, in the margin beside that drainage, there is a small notation in pencil, not ink, that reads simply, "Not run," not run, meaning the survey crew did not run the line through it, they went around. There is no explanation given. Survey crews in that era went through a great deal worse than a steep hollow. They ran lines through swamp and cane and country full of people who shot at them. And this crew, on this one drainage, wrote "not run" and went around. The local name for it was Corbin Hollow, after a family named Corbin who had held ground at the mouth of it in the 1840s and had, by the 1870s, entirely ceased to exist in the county records. Not moved, not sold out, simply stopped appearing. The last Corbin in the Newton County tax rolls is a widow Corbin, assessed in 1871 on 60 acres and 1 mule, and then nothing. But the people who lived within a day's walk of it did not call it Corbin Hollow most of the time. They had another word for it. And I am going to hold that word back for a little while because of the way the boy used it, and because of what happened to the second man who used it in front of the sheriff. Hold on to that. I will come back to it. Now, the family. The Crowders had 80 acres on a bench of ground about 2.5 miles up from the Buffalo on the west side of a creek that the family called Dunlap Creek, though it appears on no map by that name. The head of the household was Absalom Crowder, 38 years old in 1907, a lean, dark-haired, quiet-tempered man who had been born in the county and had never in his life been further from it than Harrison, which is 31 miles north. Absalom Crowder was not a farmer by preference. He was a farmer by geography. What he actually was, in the way that a man can be a thing without ever making money at it, was a woodsman. He knew timber. He could look at a stand of white oak and tell you within a few dozen board feet what was in it. He cut ties for a while for a contractor who hauled them north to the rail at Harrison, and he ran a small sorghum press in the fall, and he kept hogs on the open range the way everyone did then, marking the ears with a notch pattern recorded at the county courthouse. His wife was Naomi Crowder, born Naomi Vance, and she is the one I need you to know, because everything that happens later happens through the shape of her absence. She was 34 when she died. Typhoid in August of 1906. It came up the creek the way it always did, from a spring that had been fine for 20 years and was not fine that year, and it took 9 days from the first headache to the last breath. She was buried on a rise above the house. In ground Absalom cleared himself in one afternoon with a mattock, because he would not put her in the church cemetery 6 miles off, where he could not see her from the porch. Naomi Crowder was a broad-faced, sandy-haired woman, with a gap between her front teeth that she was self-conscious about her whole life, and that both her sons thought was the best thing about her face. She hummed while she worked, not songs she could not carry a tune, and she knew it. She hummed one phrase, 4 notes, over and over, and the 4th note was always flat, always the same amount flat, and her older boy used to fix it for her. He would sing the 4th note correct, right behind her, and she would stop and say, "You leave my note alone," and then start again, and get it wrong again on purpose, and he would fix it again. That was the game. That was the whole game. It went on for years. She hated the smell of wood smoke and wool. She would not let a coat that had been hung near the fire come into the bed. She made her boys hang their coats on the north wall of the porch, in the cold, no matter the weather, and the smell of a cold, wet wool coat is a thing both those boys associated with their mother until the day they died. Remember the 4 notes. Remember the flat one. Remember the wool. They will come back. There were 2 sons. The older was Samuel Crowder, 12 years old, in the fall of 1907, tall for 12, already showing his father's build in the shoulders, with his mother's sandy hair and his mother's gap in the teeth. He was, by every account that survives, and there are more accounts than you would expect, which I will get to, an unusually steady child. Not clever, exactly. Steady, the kind of boy who was given a job and did the job and did not need to be checked on. He had been doing a man's half share of the work since his mother died, and he had done it without being asked, and Absalom Crowder, who was not a demonstrative man, told a neighbor in the spring of 1907 that he did not know how he would have got through the winter without the boy. The younger was Elias Crowder, 9 years old, small, quick, nervous, a talker. Where Samuel was steady, Elias was weather. He was afraid of the dark and would not admit it. He asked questions until adults got tired. He had a habit of counting things, steps, fence rails, the boards in a wall, chickens under his breath, not because anyone taught him to, but because it was how his mind settled itself. I want you to hold on to that too, the counting. The boy counted before any of this started. He was doing it at 6 years old. That matters. And it matters in a way that is going to be genuinely hard to sit with by the end of this. So let it sit now, while it is only a small, odd habit of a small, odd child. After Naomi died, the household went quiet in the specific way a house goes quiet when the person who made noise in it is gone. Absalom worked. Samuel worked. Elias trailed after Samuel. The 2 brothers, who had fought the way brothers fight, more or less stopped fighting. Samuel took the younger one on as a project, taught him to set a trot line, taught him to read hog sign, walked him to the school at Cane Ridge, which met 3 months in winter and was 5 miles each way, and walked him home again. And on the way home, in the dark of the short days, when Elias got scared, Samuel let him hold the back of his coat and did not tell anyone. That is the family. 2 boys and a widowed father on 80 acres of Ozark benchland in the year 1907. Now let me put the hollow next to them. The Crowder place did not sit in Corbin Hollow. It sat about 1.25 miles from the mouth of it, up on the bench, with a shoulder of ridge between. From the Crowder porch you could not see into the hollow at all. What you could see was the timber on the ridge above it, and what you could hear on certain nights when the air was moving a particular way up the creek was well. That is one of the things that gets said. I will not vouch for it yet. I will only tell you that 4 separate people who lived within 2 miles of that hollow, interviewed at 4 separate times between 1912 and 1968, said some version of the same sentence, which is that the hollow was quieter than it ought to have been, and that the quiet had an edge on it, like the quiet in a room where somebody has just stopped talking. The Crowders had lived on that bench for 11 years without incident. 11 years is a long time. I want to be clear about that, because there is a temptation with a story like this to imagine that these people were living in a state of constant dread, and they were not. Absalom Crowder had bought the place in 1896 from a man named Renfro, and in 11 years, the worst thing that had happened on that ground was a barn fire in 1901 and a wife dead of typhoid in 1906, and neither of those is unusual for the time and place. The Crowders knew Corbin Hollow the way you know a bad road. You do not use it. You do not think about it much. You tell your children not to go there, and your children, mostly, do not go there. Samuel Crowder had been told not to go there since he could walk, and on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 15th of October, 1907, Samuel Crowder went there. I am going to tell you why. And the why is one of the parts of this case that I find hardest to get past, because it is not mysterious at all. It is the most ordinary reason in the world. He went after a hog. Open range. Hogs marked with an ear notch and turned loose in the timber to fatten on mast, gathered up in the late fall. Every family did it. The Crowders had 11 head running loose that year, and in the second week of October, Absalom and Samuel began the gather. On the 15th, they were working the timber on the north side of the creek, and one sow with a spring litter broke back on them and went down the draw toward the mouth of Corbin Hollow. Absalom Crowder was a mile off with the dogs. Samuel was closer. Samuel went after the sow, and here is where I have to slow down, because the account of what happened over the next 19 hours exists in 3 different forms, from 3 different sources, and they do not perfectly agree, and the disagreements are the interesting part. The first source is Sheriff Marion Tolliver Hask, called Tall Hask by everyone, including apparently his wife. He was 46 in 1907. In his second term, a former mule trader with a reputation for being slow to arrest and hard to lie to. His daybook for the period from 1905 to 1911 survives. It is in a private collection now. I have seen photographs of 11 of its pages, and I will be quoting from 4 of them. The second source is a set of letters written by a schoolteacher named Ora Bellamy, who taught the winter term at Cane Ridge and who wrote regularly to her sister in Fayetteville. 4 of those letters, written between October 1907 and February 1908, discuss the Crowder matter directly. They are in the university's manuscript collection, and they are the reason this case is documented at all rather than being one more piece of hill country hearsay. The third source is Elias Crowder himself, who lived until 1981 and who, at the age of 79, in 1977, sat for an oral history interview with a folklorist doing field work on Ozark narrative tradition. He did not know what the interview was for. He thought the young man wanted ballads. What he gave him instead, on a reel of tape that ran 51 minutes, was the entire account told once, straight through, with almost no prompting, in the flat voice of a man who has told a thing to himself so many times that the telling has worn smooth. That tape exists. I have listened to it, and there is a place, about 31 minutes in, where he stops for 11 seconds, and you can hear him breathing, and then he says something I am going to save for the exact right moment, because it is the single worst sentence in this entire case, and I am not going to spend it early. So, 3 sources, 1 boy, 1 hollow, 1 sow with a spring litter. Let me put you on that hillside on the 15th of October, 1907, at about 4 in the afternoon. The light in the Ozarks in mid-October comes in at a long slant and turns the whole world the color of strong tea. The oaks are half-turned. The hickories are already yellow and dropping. There is a smell to that country in that season that people who grew up there describe in almost sexual terms: leaf and nut hull and damp limestone and wood smoke, and the sound is a constant dry rattle because everything is shedding at once. Samuel Crowder, 12 years old, in a hand-me-down wool coat that smelled of the cold north wall of the porch, followed a sow down a draw toward the mouth of Corbin Hollow. He was not being reckless. This is important. The mouth of the hollow was not the hollow. There was a shelf of open ground at the bottom where the drainage flattened before it joined the creek, and people ran stock across that shelf all the time. The rule in the Crowder house, as Elias described it 70 years later, was not stay out of Corbin Hollow. The rule was, do not go up past the split rock. There was a limestone outcrop about 400 yards up the hollow from the mouth, split down the middle by a seam that a cedar had grown into and widened over what must have been 100 years. Everyone in that end of the county knew the split rock. It was the marker. Below the split rock, you were in the woods. Above the split rock, You were in the hollow." Samuel Crowder went above the split rock. Absalom Crowder, working the ridge with 2 dogs a mile north, heard nothing and noticed nothing. He came off the ridge at dusk with 4 hogs penned, and found Elias sitting on the top rail of the lot fence, alone, counting the rails out loud, which is what the boy did when he was frightened. Elias said his brother had not come back, and Absalom Crowder and I want you to understand this reaction, because it tells you something true about how these people actually lived. Absalom Crowder was not immediately alarmed. A 12-year-old out after a sow at dusk in country he knew was not an emergency. Boys stayed out. Boys camped under a ledge and came in at daylight with a story. He fed the stock. He made cornbread and fried side meat, and he and Elias ate it. He sat on the porch until full dark, with a lantern hung on the post so the boy would have a light to walk to. And at about 8 in the evening, he heard Samuel call from the timber. "Now, I need to be very careful here, and so do you." Absalom Crowder heard his son call his own name from the timber below the house, at a distance he later estimated at 200 yards. He heard it 3 times. He described the voice to the sheriff as natural. That was his word, natural. He took the lantern off the post and walked down toward it. And this is the part that gets me, every time I come back to this case. Because Absalom Crowder was not a fool, and was not a coward, and was, by every account, a level man. And he walked 40 or 50 yards down the slope with the lantern in his hand, and then he stopped. He stopped, and he stood there. And he did not go any further. When Toll Hask asked him 3 days later why he stopped, Absalom Crowder gave an answer that the sheriff wrote down verbatim, which is unusual for that daybook Hask mostly summarized. The verbatim quote is 9 words long. Absalom Crowder said, "It was calling from the wrong side of the creek." Think about that for a second. Not the wrong direction, the wrong side of the creek, meaning the voice was coming from across water, from ground his son had no reason to be on and no easy way to have reached, and the sound of it was carrying in a way that water does not usually let sound carry. He stood there with the lantern. The calling stopped. He went back to the house. He barred the door, and I want to note that the Crowder cabin had a bar, a hickory bar, in 2 iron brackets, which was not universal in that county in that period, and I will come back to why the Crowder cabin had a bar. He put Elias in the bed nearest the wall. He sat up in a chair by the door with a shotgun across his knees, and he did not sleep, and nothing else happened until dawn. At first light, on the 16th of October, Absalom Crowder went to the nearest neighbor, a man named Dob Ellery, who lived a mile and a half down the creek and who was going to become one of the most important people in this account. And by 9 that morning there were 11 men in the timber below Corbin Hollow calling Samuel Crowder's name. They found the sow. She had come back on her own overnight and was in the lot with the other stock, which nobody thought about at the time, and everybody thought about later. They found Samuel's tracks. Barefoot, he had taken his shoes off somewhere, and the shoes were never located going up the hollow past the split rock, clear as print in the damp leaf mold along the drainage. They followed them up 800 yards, past the split rock, past a fall of rock where the hollow narrows, to a place where the drainage flattens into a small bench of open ground under a stand of very large, very old white oak, and the tracks stopped. Not faded, not lost in rock, stopped. 11 men, several of them lifelong trackers who ran hounds for a living, stood in a circle and looked at a clear, barefoot track in soft ground with nothing after it. Dob Ellery, who was 51 years old and had lived in that hollow shadow his entire life, said one sentence and then would not say any more. 3 men reported it later in nearly identical words. He said, "Don't nobody call his name up here?" They searched for 4 days. They found nothing else. On the 19th of October, Sheriff Toll Hask rode down from Jasper, took statements, walked the ground himself, and wrote in his daybook an entry that is, in its entirety, 31 words long. I have seen the photograph of the page. It reads, Crowder boy, 12-year, lost in timber SE quarter, 4 days. Ground searched, no sign past the oaks. Father sound, younger boy will not speak of it. Case open. Younger boy will not speak of it. That is the 16th of October to the 19th of October, 1907. Sheriff Hask went back to Jasper. The search wound down the way searches do, from 11 men to 6 to 3, to Absalom Crowder alone, walking the same ground every day, calling a name into a hollow where a man had told him not to call it. Winter came in early that year. There was hard frost by the 1st of November, and snow before Thanksgiving. And nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened, for 194 days. And then, at approximately 6:40 in the morning on Sunday, the 26th of April, 1908, a mail carrier named Pearl Denton, riding the route between Cane Ridge and the Buffalo Crossing, came around a bend in the road in heavy river fog and found a boy standing in the middle of it, barefoot, feet cut, wearing a wool coat much too large for him, which was later identified by 3 separate people as having belonged to his brother. It was Elias Crowder. He was 9 years old. He had been missing from his father's house for a day and a night, and the mail carrier found him 11 miles from it, on a road he had no way to have reached on foot in the time available. And when Pearl Denton got down off his horse and said the boy's name, Elias Crowder did not answer, and did not move, and did not look at him. He stood in the fog with his arms at his sides, and he counted, out loud, slowly, and he had got to 400 and something by the time Denton got him up onto the horse. Denton carried him to Jasper. It took him most of the day, and that evening, in the back room of the Newton County Courthouse, with a fire going and a plate of food in front of him that he did not touch, Elias Crowder told Sheriff Marion Tolliver Hask what had happened to his brother. That is the entry I mentioned at the start. That is the one where the handwriting gets smaller. But I am not going to give it to you yet, and I want to tell you honestly why. It is not to string you along. It is because the part of that entry that matters is 4 sentences long, and if I read you those 4 sentences right now, cold, they will sound like nothing. They will sound like a scared child saying a strange thing. You will not feel it. You have to know what happened in those 194 days first. You have to know about Dob Ellery's 3 rules, and the ledger that was found in the Corbin cabin, and the woman up on Sanders Ridge who explained to a widowed farmer what kind of ground he had been living next to for 11 years without knowing it. And most of all, you have to know what came back to the Crowder place in the 2nd week of December, 1907, and stood at the tree line in the snow, and said 4 notes with the 4th one flat, because Samuel Crowder came home. That is the thing that nobody outside that hollow knew for 60 years. That is the thing Ora Bellamy would not put in a letter until February, and then put in obliquely in a sentence to her sister that reads, A.C. says the older boy is returned, but I am told not to inquire, and I shall not. Samuel Crowder came home in December of 1907, and his brother Elias, who was 9 years old, and who counted things when he was frightened, was the only person in the world who knew, from the first night, that the boy sleeping in his brother's bed was not his brother. We will get to how he knew. It was the wool. But before the wool, the winter. Before the winter, the rules. Let me back up to the last week of October, 1907, because there is a scene there that I think is the true beginning of this case, and it involves a man walking 1.5 miles up a creek in the rain to say 3 things to a neighbor he had known for 11 years and had never once discussed this subject with. Dob Ellery was 51. He had 80 acres and a wife named Cyrilda, and 4 grown children, 3 of whom had already gone to Oklahoma. He was a short, thick, red-faced man who ran hounds and made a little whiskey and had a reputation for being agreeable. Nobody in that end of the county described Dob Ellery as superstitious. Several people described him as the least superstitious man they knew, which is the kind of thing that only gets said about a person after they have said something that made everybody uncomfortable. He came up to the Crowder place on the 28th of October, in the afternoon, in a cold rain. He did not come inside. Absalom Crowder offered, and he said no. He stood on the porch, under the eave, with the water coming off the shakes a foot in front of his face, and he said what he had come to say. Elias Crowder was 9 years old and was in the house, and he was standing about 4 feet inside the door, and he heard every word of it. He repeated it, 70 years later, into a folklorist's microphone. And when he did something that I find almost unbearable to listen to. He did Dob Ellery's voice. He was 79 years old, and he did a dead man's voice from 1907, and it was clearly an impression he had done to himself many times. Here is what Dob Ellery said, as Elias Crowder gave it back. He said, "Ab, I'm going to tell you 3 things, and then I ain't going to speak on it again, not to you, not to nobody. Don't ask me after, I won't answer." And Absalom Crowder said, "All right." The first thing was this. Dob Ellery said, "Don't answer a voice you can't see. Not at night, not in fog, not through a wall. If you can't see the mouth it's coming out of, you don't answer it, not even to say who's there." The second thing was this. He said, "Don't go up past that rock after him, not in daylight, not in a crowd, not with a gun. What's up there don't care how many of you there is." And the third thing, and this is the one that goes through you, the third thing Dob Ellery said was, "If he comes back, don't let him in the first night." Absalom Crowder said nothing for a while, and then he said, "Dob, my boy is dead." And Dob Ellery said, "I hope so." Then he stepped off the porch into the rain and walked home, and he never discussed the matter with Absalom Crowder again for the rest of his life. Not in December, not in January, not on the 2 occasions that winter when he had reason to. He kept that word exactly. 3 rules. Do not answer a voice you cannot see. Do not go past the rock. Do not let him in the first night. I want you to keep a mental hand on all 3 of those, because over the next 90 days, every single one of them is going to come up, and 2 of them are going to be broken. Now let me tell you why the Crowder cabin had a bar on the door. Most cabins in that country in that period had a latch. A wooden latch on a string, the string out through a hole, and you pulled the string in at night. Bars were for stock buildings and for town. A bar in a private house was a thing a man built for a reason. The Crowder cabin was built in 1879 by the man Absalom bought it from, a man named Ott Renfro. Absalom Crowder bought the place in 1896, and in the transaction, which was a handshake and a payment schedule and a deed filed in Jasper Ott, Renfro told the buyer one thing about the property that was not on the deed. He said, "The bar stays. Don't take it off. Don't burn it." And Absalom Crowder, who was 27 years old at the time and newly married and did not care one way or the other about a piece of hickory in 2 iron brackets, said all right. Now, Ott Renfro had lived on that place for 17 years. He had a wife and, at various times, 5 children. When he sold to Crowder in 1896, he was leaving the county entirely, going to Texas, and he was going in a hurry, and he sold 80 acres of improved bench land with a house, a barn, a spring, and a young orchard for a price that Absalom Crowder later described as foolish. Elias Crowder, telling this in 1977, said that his father told him about the bar exactly once, in December of 1907, in the middle of everything, and that the way his father said it made it clear he had been thinking about it for 11 years. Absalom Crowder said, "Renfro told me the bar stays. He never said what for. I never asked. That was my whole error right there, son. I never asked." I have gone looking for Ott Renfro. There is a Renfro family in the Newton County records through the 1880s and 90s, and they do disappear from the rolls after 1896, which is consistent with a move to Texas. I have not been able to trace them beyond that, and I want to be honest about the limits of the record here, rather than invent a satisfying ending for a man who is not the subject of this account. Ott Renfro walks into this story once, in 1896, to say 4 words about a piece of hickory, and then he walks out of it forever. But those 4 words saved a child's life. I will show you exactly when. So, late October into November, 1907, here is the thing about grief in an isolated place. It has nowhere to go. In a town, a widower with a lost son is surrounded by a machinery of condolence. The church, the neighbors, the merchants, the whole apparatus of a community that keeps showing up at your door with food until you are forced back into the world. On 80 acres, 2.5 miles up a creek, with the nearest neighbor a 1.5 miles off, there is no machinery. There is you, and a 9-year-old, and 400 chores, and a ridgeline that does not change. Absalom Crowder stopped shaving. Ora Bellamy, the schoolteacher, noted it in a letter dated the 9th of November, 1907. She saw him at Cane Ridge when he brought Elias in for the winter term, and she described him to her sister as a man wearing his own clothes badly. She also wrote that the younger Crowder boy does not attend to lessons but is not disobedient, and counts under his breath in a manner the other children have begun to mock. Elias went to school for 11 days that winter and then stopped. His father needed him. That is the reason given. It is probably true. It is also probably not the whole reason, because things had already started. Now, I want to handle this next part carefully, because this is where a story like this either earns your attention or loses it, and the difference is entirely in the details. So let me give you the details, in order as they were reported, and let me be clear about which source each one comes from. The first thing was the tree line. This comes from Elias on the tape, and it is the kind of observation that a 9-year-old would make and an adult would not, which is one of the reasons I take it seriously. Below the Crowder house, the pasture ran down about 200 yards to where the timber started. That edge, the place where cleared ground becomes woods, is never a clean line on a real farm. It is a mess. It is saplings and blackberry and sumac and volunteer cedar, a gradient 30 or 40 feet deep, because the woods are always trying to come back, and the farmer is always beating them back, and the boundary is the record of that argument. Elias Crowder said that in the first week of November, 1907, the tree line below the house got clean. Not cut, not cleared. Clean. He said the sumac and the blackberry that had been in that edge his whole life was still there, but the line where the wood started, had gone straight, he said, on the tape, and this is a direct quote from the recording. It got to where you could have run a string along it, he told his father. His father walked down and looked and said the boy was imagining it, and then, according to Elias, his father stood there for a long time with his hands in his coat pockets and then came back up to the house and did not say anything else about it for the rest of the day. The second thing was the dogs. Absalom Crowder ran 2 hounds and kept a yard dog, a bitch called Peg. In the first week of November, all 3 stopped going below the house. They would go to a point roughly 90 yards down the pasture and no further. The hounds would take a scent and run it to that line, and stop and come back. Peg would not leave the yard at all after dark, which for a yard dog is normal, but she also would not face downhill. Elias described her lying in the yard with her back to the pasture and her face to the house, which, if you have ever owned a dog, you will recognize as wrong. Dogs face the thing they are worried about. By the end of November, all 3 dogs were sleeping under the house. The third thing was the temperature, And this one is the one that people always want to explain away, and I will give you the explanations in a minute. But let me give you the observation first. Elias Crowder said that starting in the second week of November, the cold came into the house from the wrong direction. The cabin was a single-pen log house with a loft, a stone chimney on the east gable, a door on the south, and 2 windows. Cold in a house like that comes from the north wall and up through the floor. That is physics, and everyone who has ever lived in one knows it in their body. Elias said that in November of 1907, the cold in that house came from the south, from the door. He said you could feel the difference walking across the room. He said, and again this is direct from the tape, it come in at the door like something had just walked in and left it standing open, and the door was shut and barred. Now, the explanations. Wind eddies in hollow country are genuinely strange, and a south wind funneling up a creek can absolutely put cold against a south wall in a way that surprises people. Log cabins settle, and chink falls out, and a gap you did not know about will make a room behave oddly. A grieving 9-year-old in a house where the older brother has just vanished is a 9-year-old who will find the world full of wrongness because his world is wrong. All of that is true. Hold all of that. I am not going to pretend those explanations do not exist, because the moment I do that, you stop trusting me, and you should stop trusting me. But hold this too, because there is a fourth thing, and the fourth thing has a witness who was not a 9-year-old, and was not grieving, and did not want to be involved. On the 22nd of November, 1907, a man named Cleve Standridge, who was hauling a load of sorghum barrels down the creek road, stopped at the Crowder place to water his team. He was there for perhaps 40 minutes in the middle of the afternoon. Clear day, no wind to speak of. Cleve Standridge later told Sheriff Hask, and Hask wrote it in the daybook, and this is one of the 4 pages I have seen that while he was in the Crowder lot, he heard a woman humming in the house. Absalom Crowder was standing next to him. Elias Crowder was standing next to him. There was nobody else on the place. Naomi Crowder had been dead 15 months. Standridge said, and I am quoting Hask's summary here rather than the man himself, Standridge states he took it for a neighbor woman and made no remark. States Crowder gave no sign of hearing it. States the boy did. States the boy did. That is the 22nd of November. 4 notes, the 4th one flat. And here is what I need you to understand about that detail, because it is the hinge on which this entire case turns, and if you get it now, everything that comes after will land the way it should. Whatever was doing that was not doing an impression of Naomi Crowder for Absalom Crowder's benefit. Absalom did not hear it, or did not react. It was doing it where the boys could hear it. It was not calling the widower. It was calling the children. Let me sit in November for a while longer, because there is a texture to that month that I want you to have. The Ozarks in late November are a stripped country. Everything is down. The oaks hold their leaves longest. A white oak will keep brown leaves into February, but by Thanksgiving, the hickory and the maple and the walnut are bare, and you can suddenly see through a woods you could not see through in October. Distances change. A ridge you have looked at all summer as a green wall becomes a lattice, and you can see the shape of the land under it for the first time in 6 months, and every year people who live there say the same thing. It looks bigger in the winter. The Crowder place had a routine, and the routine held. Absalom cut wood. There is a figure in the record here that I find quietly devastating. Ora Bellamy wrote in December that Absalom Crowder had cut and ricked something like 18 cords of firewood since October, which is roughly 3 times what a household of 2 needed for a winter. He was not preparing. He was doing something with his arms. Elias fed stock, carried water from the spring, hunted the timber above the house with a single-shot .22 his brother had used, and counted. He counted the rails in the lot fence, which was 206. He counted the steps from the porch to the spring, which was 131. He counted the boards in the loft ceiling above his bed, which was 44, and he counted them most nights, and on the nights he could not sleep, he counted them more than once. And in the 2nd week of December, it snowed. It came in on the night of the 9th, wet and heavy, 6 or 7 inches by morning, and then it turned off cold and stayed cold, and that snow lay on the ground in the shaded hollows for 19 days. That is a long stretch of unbroken snow for that latitude, and it is confirmed in the weather records for the region, which is a small thing, but I like being able to hand you a small thing that checks out. Snow changes a place like that completely. Sound carries differently. The woods go silent. And most importantly, for what is coming, the ground keeps a record. You can read a snow-covered farm like a page. You know what came into the yard and what left. You know that the fox crossed the pasture at an angle, that the rabbits worked the brush pile, that a possum went under the corn crib and did not come out. Nothing moves on a farm in snow without writing it down. Which is how Elias Crowder came to be standing in the yard at first light on the morning of the 11th of December, 1907, looking at a set of barefoot tracks that came up out of the timber, crossed the pasture, came to within about 30 feet of the house, and stopped, barefoot, in snow, in 12-degree weather, and went back. That is the first set. There were more. I am going to walk you through all of them, because the tracks are the part of this case that has a physical logic to them, and the logic is the horror. The first set on the 11th of December came up and stopped and went back. Elias measured it with his own foot, the way a child does, and told his father the tracks were bigger than his and smaller than his father's. The second set was on the 13th. Same route, up from the timber, but this time the tracks came around the house, all the way around, once, and then went back down. And here is the detail. This is the one that Elias Crowder, at 79 years old, still could not say without stopping first. Absalom Crowder went out and followed the second set of tracks down to the timber, and when he came back, he sat down at the table and did not eat. And Elias asked him what was wrong, and his father said, "The strides longer going back." Think about that for 1 second. Really do it. The tracks that came up out of the timber toward the house had a stride of a certain length, consistent with a boy of 12. The tracks that went back down had a longer stride, same feet, same size, same direction of travel, out and back. Something came up to that house at one size and went back down at another. And this is the reading that Elias came to as an adult, and it is worse. Something came up to that house learning how to walk, and by the time it left, it had gotten better at it. Absalom Crowder did not sleep after the 13th of December. He sat in the chair by the door with the shotgun. Elias, in the loft, counted the 44 boards. Sometimes he counted them out loud, and his father did not tell him to stop. The third set of tracks was on the 15th, and it did not stop at 30 feet, and it did not circle the house. It came to the door. There were, in the packed snow on the flat stone that served as the Crowder doorstep, the prints of 2 bare feet, side by side, toes toward the door, and the snow around them was melted out in a ring about a foot across, the way snow melts when something warm stands on it a long while. A long while. That is the part. Not a step, a stand. Something stood at that door in 12-degree weather, barefoot, long enough to melt a ring in the snow, and did not knock, and did not call, and went away. Absalom Crowder rode to Jasper on the 16th of December, 1907, in the snow, 31 miles round trip, to tell the sheriff of Newton County that something was coming to his house at night. And Toll Hask and I have to give the man his due here, because plenty of sheriffs in 1907 would have sent a grieving father home with a word about nerves. Toll Hask saddled up and rode back with him, and spent 2 nights on the Crowder place. Nothing happened either night. Nothing ever happens when the sheriff is there. That is not a joke, and it is not a coincidence. And it is going to matter enormously later because of something Ivorine Lusk says about being counted. But Hask did walk the ground on the 17th, in daylight, in snow, and he did follow the track line down into the timber himself, and he did write an entry in the daybook about it, and this is the second of the 4 pages I have seen, and it is longer than the first, and it is where the handwriting starts to change. The entry, dated the 17th of December, 1907, reads, "At Crowder, place 2 nights. Tracks as described, bare feet, boy size or near. Followed down 700 yeeds to the creek. Tracks enter the water and do not come out either. Bank so far as I could find, and I looked both ways, 300 wides. Crowder is not making these. He has not the guile, and his boots do not fit. I do not know what to write here. Told him to keep the door barred and to send for me. He asked me was I coming back. I said yes, I will. I do not know what to write here." That is a sheriff, in his own daybook, which nobody was ever supposed to read. Now here is where I want to place the midpoint marker in this account, because from here the shape of it changes, and I would rather step out of the story for 30 seconds on a clean break than break it later at a bad moment. If you are still here, and if you have got this far, you are the kind of person this channel is made for. The collection I mentioned, What the Hollows Keep, is linked below. 10 cases, 9 hours, the same voice, the same dark. It is there for the nights when this one ends too soon. And tell me something in the comments while you are here. Have you ever seen tracks you could not explain? In snow, in mud, on a beach? I want to read those. I read all of them. Now then, back to it. Back to the 18th of December, 1907, which is the day Sheriff Tall Hask rode out of that hollow, and the 19th of December, 1907, which is the day Samuel Crowder came home. It was a Thursday. There had been no new snow since the 9th, but it had not thawed either, so the old snow was crusted and gray and printed all over with the record of 10 days. Absalom Crowder was in the barn at dusk, and Elias was in the house, and the light was going the way it goes on a clear December evening in that country, fast and blue and cold. And Elias Crowder heard 4 notes from the tree line. He said, on the tape, that he did not go to the window. He said he was 9 years old, and he had been afraid of the dark his entire short life, and he had been in that house for 2 months, listening to it get worse, and when he heard his mother humming at the bottom of the pasture, he did not go to the window. He got down on the floor between the bed and the wall, and he put his hands over his ears, and he counted the boards in the ceiling from memory, 44, and then he counted them again. He said, "I done that till my daddy come in." Absalom Crowder came in from the barn, maybe 10 minutes later. He had heard nothing. He was, remember, the one who could not hear it, or who did not react. That pattern holds all the way through, and it is one of the strangest and most consistent features of this whole account. And then, at some point in the following hour, after full dark, there was a knock at the door. Now, Dob Ellery's 3rd rule. Say it with me. If he comes back, don't let him in the first night. There was a knock at the door, and a voice on the other side of it said, "Daddy." And Absalom Crowder, who had barred that door every night for 64 nights, who had sat with a shotgun across his knees, who had ridden 31 miles in the snow, to tell the law that something was coming to his house, Absalom Crowder went to the door. Elias said his father stood there with his hand on the bar for what felt to a 9-year-old like a very long time. He said his father asked one question through the door. He asked, "Where you been?" And the voice said, "It's cold, Daddy." And Absalom Crowder lifted the bar. I have thought about this moment more than any other moment in this case, and I want to say something in that man's defense, because it is easy from 119 years away, in a warm room, to say that he broke the rule, and he should not have. He had buried his wife 15 months before. He had lost his older son in October. He had spent 2 months in a silent house with a frightened child, cutting 18 cords of wood he did not need, and every single night of those 2 months he had lain awake, wanting exactly one thing in the world. And then that one thing knocked on his door and said it was cold. There is not a man alive who lifts that bar, and there is not a man alive who does not. That is why it works. Whatever that thing was, it did not need to break the door. It needed 64 nights and 1 sentence. So the bar came up, and the door came open, and Samuel Crowder walked into the house. Let me describe him as his brother described him, because the description is very specific and very strange. And it took me a long time to understand why it is as unsettling as it is. He was barefoot. He had no coat. He was wearing the same shirt and trousers he had gone into the hollow in on the 15th of October, and they were not torn, and they were not filthy, and they were dry. He was not thin. 65 days in the woods in an Ozark autumn would have rendered a 12-year-old down to nothing. He was not rendered down. Elias said he looked the same, exactly the same weight in the face, same everything. His feet were clean. That is the one. That is the detail that Elias Crowder returned to over and over, 70 years later, in a way that made it obvious it had been the burr under his mind for a lifetime. A boy walks up out of a hollow through 10-day-old crusted snow, and his feet are clean, not just uninjured, clean. No mud, no leaf, no blood, nothing under the nails. And he was cold. Absalom put his hands on the boy's face, and said he was cold as the ground, and put him by the fire, and wrapped him in a quilt, and gave him cornbread and milk, and the boy ate it. He ate it. I want to note that, because there is a version of this kind of story where the returned thing does not eat, and that is not what happened here. It ate, it drank, it slept, it worked. That is what makes this one so much worse than the tidy version. It was not obviously a corpse or a shade or a puppet. It was a boy for weeks. It was a boy who did chores and answered when spoken to and laughed at the right places. It was only wrong in the small ways. The first small way happened that night. Within the first hour, Absalom Crowder asked his son where he had been, and the boy said he did not remember. He said he remembered going after the sow, and then he said he remembered being cold, and then he said he remembered walking up to the house. 65 days, gone, which, honestly, is what a real lost child might say. Trauma does that. Absalom accepted it. Of course he accepted it. He would have accepted anything. And then the boy took off his shirt to be warm by the fire, and Elias saw his brother's back. Samuel Crowder had a scar. He had taken a bad fall off a rail fence in 1903 at the age of 8 and opened his back on a snag. And Naomi Crowder had sewn it up herself with a needle and carpet thread because the nearest doctor was in Jasper, and it had left a raised white line about 4 inches long under the left shoulder blade, crooked in the middle where she had pulled 1 stitch too tight and had cried about it for a week. The scar was there. It was on the right. Elias Crowder, 9 years old, sitting on the far side of the room, looked at his brother's bear back in the firelight and saw a scar he had known his whole life, 4 inches long, crooked in the middle, on the wrong side. He did not say anything. He was 9. Think about being 9 years old and knowing that. Now, I want to be rigorous. There is an obvious counter-explanation, which is that a 9-year-old misremembered which side of his brother's back the scar was on. Children get left and right wrong. Adults get left and right wrong. And a boy in that state, in that firelight, could absolutely have flipped it. Except that Elias Crowder was not the only person who noticed something like this. And this is where the schoolteacher's letters become indispensable. Because Ora Bellamy saw Samuel Crowder in January of 1908, in daylight, in a room with 11 other children, and she wrote about him to her sister, and what she wrote is one of the most quietly horrible paragraphs I have ever read in a personal letter. I will get there. It is dated the 19th of January, 1908. Hold that date. Back to the 19th of December. They put Samuel in his bed. The two brothers shared the loft 2 ticks on the floor, 4 feet apart, under 44 boards. Absalom Crowder, for the first night in 64, slept in the bed rather than the chair, and Elias Crowder lay in the dark 4 feet from the thing that had come in out of the snow, and did not sleep, and counted. And at some point in the night, the thing 4 feet away from him said, "You leave my note alone." That is the game. That was his mother's line. That was the answer in the humming game. She hums the 4th note flat. Samuel sings it right behind her correctly, and she says, "You leave my note alone." It said the line, in the dark, unprompted, to the wrong person. It said the mother's half. And Elias Crowder and I want you to understand that this is the moment, this is the exact moment when a 9-year-old child understood his situation completely. Elias Crowder said nothing back, and did not move, and lay there until morning with his eyes open. He said on the tape, "I knowed then. I knowed the whole thing then, the first night. And there wasn't a soul I could tell it to. Now, the wool. I told you at the start that it was the wool, and here is what I meant." The next morning, the 20th of December, was a working day like any other, because on a farm in December there is no such thing as a day off, not even the day after your dead son comes back. Stock has to be fed. Water has to be broken in the trough. Wood has to come in. Absalom Crowder took his older son's coat down off a peg, the wool coat, the one that had been hanging on the north wall of the porch since the 15th of October, and handed it to him. And Samuel Crowder put it on, and that was it. That was the whole thing. That was the moment that made Elias certain, in a way that the scar and the humming had only made him afraid, because the coat had been on the north wall of the porch, cold, outside, the way their mother had insisted for years, for every coat in that house, because she could not stand the smell of wood smoke in wool. But it had not been on the north wall since October. Absalom Crowder had brought the coats inside at the end of October, the way you do when your wife has been dead 15 months, and the rules she made have quietly stopped applying. He had hung them by the fire, all winter, 2 months. That coat stank of wood smoke. It had been cooking in it for 8 weeks. And Samuel Crowder, the real Samuel Crowder, the one who had lived his entire life under his mother's rule, who had hung his coat on the cold north wall in the rain and in the snow and in the dark since he was old enough to reach the peg, who had gone out into a freezing morning 100 times, rather than wear a coat that smelled of the fire, took that coat and put it on, and did not say one word about it. Elias said, on the tape, in the flattest voice on the whole recording, "Sam would have raised the roof. The horror is never the monster. The horror is that it did not know about the coat." So, what do? You are 9 years old. It is the 20th of December, 1907. You are 2.5 miles up a creek in Newton County, Arkansas. Your mother is dead. Your brother is dead. Your father is happier than you have seen him in 15 months. And the reason he is happy is sitting at the table, eating cornbread, and wearing a coat that smells like a chimney. What do? Here is what Elias Crowder did. And I want to say plainly that I think it is the single most impressive thing any child in any of these accounts has ever done. He watched. For 52 days, he watched. And he wrote nothing down because he could barely write. And he told nobody because there was nobody, and he built himself a system out of the only tool he had, which was counting. He counted the thing. He started counting how many steps it took to cross the room. He counted how long it stood still. He counted how many times it blinked while his father talked to it, and the answer, he said, was that it blinked in patterns, in runs, like something remembering to. He counted the seconds between when a question was asked and when it answered, and he learned that the answer time was always the same, always about 2, no matter how hard the question was. Ask it what day it is, 2. Ask it what its mother's name was, 2. Ask it something it could not possibly know, 2. A real person's answer time varies. That is the whole texture of talking to a human being. Some answers are instant, and some take a moment. This thing had one speed, and once you know that, you cannot unknow it, and you can never sit at a table with it again without hearing the count in your head. Now, the other thing that happened over those 52 days, and it is important, is that it got better. That is the trajectory. That is the arc of the entire middle of this case. It arrived on the 19th of December as an approximation, and it improved daily, and the improvement was visible, and the improvement was the most frightening thing about it. Week 1. It did not know the coat. It said the mother's line instead of the son's. It answered everything in 2 seconds. Week 3. Elias said it had started to vary the answer time. Not correctly, it overcorrected, sometimes waiting far too long, but it had noticed the problem and was working on it. Week 5. It fixed the humming. It hummed the 4 notes, and it got the 4th one flat. And it got it flat by exactly the right amount. And when Elias walked into the room, it stopped and looked at him and waited. And Elias understood, with a clarity that made him sick, that it was waiting for him to sing the 4th note correctly, because that was the game, and it had finally learned the game, and it wanted to play. He did not sing it. He never sang it. He said that was the closest he came to running out of the house in the whole 52 days. Week 7. It started using Samuel's actual verbal tics. Samuel had said, "I reckon so," in a particular way, running the words together. It had not said that once in the first month. In the last 2 weeks, it said it constantly. Do you see what that is? Do you see what that means? It was not remembering. It was learning. From them. From the house. From the 2 people in it who kept, without meaning to, showing it what it had got wrong. Every time Absalom Crowder said, "You don't sound like yourself, son," he was teaching it. Every time Elias flinched at something, he was marking a card. They were the source material. They were feeding it at the table 3 times a day for 52 days. And here is the question that hangs over that entire winter. The question that Elias Crowder said he thought about every day of his life for 74 years. What was it going to be when it finished? What is the finished version of that? What does it do when it can hum the note right and wear the coat right and say, "I reckon so right," and answer in the correct variable time and never once slip, because it is not doing all that to eat cornbread on a bench farm in Newton County? Hold that. We will come back to it, and we will come back to it with an answer, and the answer comes from an old woman on Sanders Ridge, and it is 4 words long, and I promise you it is worth the wait. Before I give you January, I want to give you 1 day out of those 52, because a list of small wrongnesses is not the same thing as living inside them, and there is 1 day that Elias described at length and in order, and it is the closest we can get to what that winter actually felt like from the inside. It was the 4th or 5th of January, 1908. A Saturday, he thought. Absalom Crowder sent both boys to the spring. That was ordinary. The spring was 131 steps from the porch. Elias knew the number, the way you know your own address. Down a slope to a rock ledge where the water came out cold and constant, with a stone-walled box built around it to keep the leaves out. 2 boys, 2 buckets, twice a day, every day of the year. It was the most routine errand on that farm, and it was the first time since the 19th of December that Absalom had sent them anywhere out of his sight together. Elias said he did not argue. You did not argue with your father in 1908 over 80 acres of Newton County. He took his bucket and he walked. and the thing walked beside him, and neither of them said anything for a while. Here is what he remembered. Waist and fiver. He remembered that it matched his stride, not naturally, deliberately, and badly at first. He said he noticed within about 20 steps that it was walking in step with him, left foot to left foot, and he said he tried an experiment. He shortened his stride, and it shortened its stride. He lengthened it. It lengthened. He stopped walking altogether, in the middle of the slope, with a bucket in his hand, and it stopped, half a step later, and stood there, and waited, and did not ask him why he had stopped. A real 12-year-old boy asks. A real 12-year-old boy says, "What are you doing?" or "Come on," or nothing at all, but keeps walking, because a 12-year-old brother does not stand in the cold on a hillside, waiting for his 9-year-old brother to explain himself. It waited. Elias said it would have waited all day. He started walking again, and it started walking again, and he counted the steps, and he said out loud, quietly, the numbers, and at about 60 it said something. It said, "You always do that." And Elias said, "Do what?" And it said, "The numbers." That is the first and only time the thing ever remarked on his counting during those 52 days. And Elias, 9 years old, on a hillside, with no adult inside 400 yards, said the bravest thing he ever said in his life, which was, "You never used to notice." And it did not answer. They got to the spring. And this is the part. The spring box was under a rock ledge, in shadow, and there was ice on the stones around it, and a little ice at the lip of the box, and the water came out at 54 degrees the way spring water does in that country year-round, and it steamed a little in the January air. Elias filled his bucket, and the thing knelt down at the edge of the box and looked at the water for a long time. He said it looked at its own reflection. He was very specific about this. He said it knelt there on the ice, with its hands on the stone, and it looked down into that box, and it moved its head slowly, side to side, the way a person does when they are checking something in a mirror, and then it made a face. Not a grimace. A face. An expression. It arranged its mouth into a small smile, and held it, and looked at it, and let it go, and did it again. 3 times. And Elias Crowder stood 4 feet behind it, with a full bucket in his hand, and understood that he was watching something practice a smile in a spring box on a Saturday morning. He said he did not run. He said he could not have said why then, and could not say why at 79 either, except that he had already worked out that running was the thing that would tell it he knew. So he stood there, and when it stood up and turned around, its face was completely normal, and it picked up its bucket, and they walked back up the hill, 131 steps, in step, and it said, "I reckon so." About nothing at all, because that was the week it started saying that. Their father was on the porch when they came up. He had been on the porch the whole time. Elias said he could tell from the way the man was standing that he had not gone inside once. Absalom Crowder looked at his younger son's face, and he did not ask him anything, and Elias did not tell him anything. And that, more than any single strange event that winter, is the shape of what happened in that house. 2 people, a father and a child, both of them certain, neither of them saying it, sitting down to eat 3 times a day, with a thing that was getting better at them. Now, let me give you January. January of 1908 was mild. The snow was off by the end of December, and the first 3 weeks of January ran wet and gray and above freezing, which in that country means mud to the ankle and a creek running high. 2 things happened in January that matter. The first is that Absalom Crowder began to come apart. The second is Ora Bellamy's letter of the 19th. Take the father first. Here is the terrible mechanism of it. For 64 days, Absalom Crowder had been a man holding himself together around a hole, and then the hole was filled. And he let go completely. All at once, the way a man does when the emergency ends. And then, over the following weeks, he began to understand at some level below language that the thing that had filled the hole was not his son. He never said it. Not once, to anybody, in any surviving record. But you can watch it happen from the outside. He stopped sending the boy on errands alone. He stopped letting him near the stock. There is a specific incident here, in the second week of January, where the cow would not be led by Samuel and kicked out the side of the stall trying to get away from him, and Absalom took the boy out of the barn and never sent him back in. He started sleeping in the chair by the door again, which is a thing I need you to look at directly. His son was home. The danger was over, and he moved back to the chair by the door with the shotgun and barred the door at night, with the boy inside. He was not barring the door to keep something out anymore. Read that entry from Hask again in your head, and then read this. A man sat in a chair by a barred door every night in January of 1908 in a one-room cabin with both of his children asleep in the loft above him. He was barring it to keep it in a room he could see. And the third thing. Absalom Crowder started asking questions. Elias said his father asked questions all through January. Small ones, at meals, in a light voice. What was your mother's people's name? Which hand did you hurt that time on the fro? What did we call the red heifer? And the thing got them right. More and more, it got them right. And every time it got one right, Elias said, his father's face did something that the boy could not read at 9 and could read perfectly at 79, which was not relief. It was the face of a man checking a lock he already knows is broken. Now, the 19th of January, 1908. Ora Bellamy. The winter term at Cane Ridge School ran January through March. Absalom Crowder sent both boys, which surprises people, but you have to understand, if you keep your recently returned son home from school after the entire county knows he came back, you are telling the entire county something. He sent them, of course he sent them. Ora Bellamy was 26 years old, from Fayetteville, teaching her second winter in the county. She had 11 students that term ranging from 6 to 15. She wrote her sister roughly every other week. Her letters are ordinary weather, boarding arrangements, complaints about the stove, gossip. And then there is the letter of the 19th of January, 1908, which is not ordinary. I am going to paraphrase it closely rather than read it whole. But the substance is this. She writes that the Crowder boy who was lost in the autumn has been returned to his family and is attending, and that she had expected him to be changed by his ordeal, and he is not changed in any way she can name, and that this is the difficulty. She writes that he is a good student, better than before. In fact, she notes that his sums have improved and that his reading aloud is very fluent. And then she writes the paragraph. She writes that on the 16th of January she kept the school in at noon because of rain, and the children played a game they played, which was a copying game. One child makes a gesture, and the next repeats it around the circle. And she writes that Samuel Crowder was very good at it. Unusually good, that he did not simply copy the gesture. He copied the child, the way that child stood, the way that child held their head, and that the other children laughed at first because it was a very good imitation, and then stopped laughing. And she writes, and this is the sentence, this is the one she writes, that when it came around to the Crowder boy the second time, he did an imitation of her, of the teacher, standing at the front of the room, and she says he had her exactly, and that she had never in her life seen herself from the outside before, and that she asked him to stop, and he stopped immediately, and sat down and was perfectly polite for the rest of the day. And then she writes one more line. And then she changes the subject and never mentions him again in any letter until February, and the line is, I do not know how he should have seen me from that side of the room. Now I have to tell you about the ledger. This is the document that turns this case from a family tragedy into something older. And I need to set it up properly, because the way it was found is almost as strange as what is in it. In the last week of January, 1908, Absalom Crowder went down to the Corbin place. The Corbin place was the ruin at the mouth of the hollow, the 60 acres that had belonged to the family that stopped appearing in the tax rolls after 1871. By 1908, the cabin had been standing empty for at least 37 years. The roof was mostly down. The chimney was standing, because chimneys always are. There was a spring house dug into the bank with a stone lintel, and that was intact, because a spring house dug into a bank is essentially a cave with a door, and it takes a century to kill one. Nobody had lived there in 37 years, and nobody had scavenged it either, which, in that time and place, is remarkable. A ruined cabin is free material window glass, hinges, hardware, squared timber, hand-forged nails worth pulling. Farms in the Ozarks in that era were built out of other farms, and the Corbin place, a mile and a quarter from 4 different households, sat there untouched from 1871 to 1908, with its hinges still on. Nobody would go down there. That is the only explanation, and everybody involved knew it, and nobody said it out loud. Absalom Crowder went down there on a gray day at the end of January, because he had run out of other things to do. He did not tell his sons where he was going. He took the shotgun, and he walked the mile and a quarter down the creek, and he spent, by his own account to the sheriff, most of a day going through what was left. He found the ledger in the spring house, in a tin box, on a stone shelf above the waterline, wrapped in oilcloth, wrapped on a shelf. Above the waterline, somebody put it there on purpose. Somebody put it where water would not get it, and where it would keep, in the one structure on that farm that was going to outlast everything else, and then that somebody walked away and never came back for it. The ledger is a farm account book, roughly 6 inches by 12, cloth-bound, the kind a merchant sold for a quarter. It was started in 1864 as an actual account book. Hogs sold, corn ground, days worked, money owed in a plain hand. And then, in 1869, it stops being an account book. The writer is Mahala Corbin. She was, as best as the census records can be made to say, born about 1822 in Tennessee, married a Corbin, came to Newton County in the 1840s, and was the widow Corbin, who was assessed on 60 acres and 1 mule in 1871, and then never assessed again. She could write. Not well, but clearly, and with the flat, unhurried rhythm of somebody who wrote a little every day for years and never once wrote for an audience. There is no performance in it. That is what makes it hard to read. I am going to give you her account in her own shape, tidied only where the spelling would trip your ear. It runs, in the relevant section, from the autumn of 1869 to the spring of 1871, and it is roughly 9 pages. She begins in October of 1869. She writes that her husband, whose name was Wiley, took a hog dog up the hollow after a boar in the fall of that year, and came back in the evening without the dog and without the boar, and that he sat down at the fire and did not speak that night, and that when she asked him in the morning, he said he had heard his father calling him from up the hollow, and that his father had been dead 11 years and buried in Tennessee. She writes, I said it was the wind in the rock. He said it said his name, and it said it wrong. It called him Weil. And nobody living called him that but his daddy, and his daddy said it wrong on purpose because it made him sore. That is the first entry. Right there in 1869, before anybody in this account was born, there it is. The voice that knows the private thing and gets it slightly, deliberately wrong. She writes that they let it alone for a year and nothing came of it. Then, in November of 1870, her middle son, she had 4 children living, and this one she calls only the boy, which I think tells you something about how she was writing by then her middle son did not come in. She writes, "We hunted him 4 days. Wiley went up past the split rock, which I begged him not to, and he found where the tracks quit. He come back and he told me they quit, and I said, 'Quit how?' And he said, 'Mahala, they just quit.'" Same detail, 1870. 37 years before the Crowders. The tracks just quit, in the same place, past the same rock, under what she calls the Big Oaks. And then, in December of 1870, and I want you to notice the month, because it is the same month, 37 years apart, and I do not know what to do with that, but I am not going to pretend I did not see it. In December of 1870, her son came back. Here is her account, and this is the passage that I think is the center of this entire case. She writes, "He come to the door on the 8th night after the snow, and said, 'Mama, it is cold,' and Wiley put up the bar. I did not want him to. I said, 'Wiley, wait.' He would not wait. The boy sat by the fire, and eat his supper, and answered to everything. He was not thin. His feet was clean. He was not thin. His feet was clean." 1907 had not happened yet. Elias Crowder had not been born and would not be born for 28 years. And a woman writing by a fire in December of 1870 wrote down the 2 details that a 9-year-old boy would fix on 37 years later in the same order. Nobody was copying anybody. There is no chain of transmission here. Absalom Crowder read this ledger in January of 1908, but Elias Crowder never did. The ledger left the family entirely in 1911, and Elias was told nothing about its contents at 9 years old, and he gave his account in 1977 to a folklorist who had never heard of Mahala Corbin. 2 witnesses, 37 years apart, independently produced his feet were clean. Let me keep going, because it gets worse. Mahala Corbin writes that the boy stayed with them through the winter of 1870 and into the spring of 1871. She writes that he worked. She writes that he was pleasant. And then she writes a series of small observations over several pages that are, in substance, exactly the 52 days that Elias Crowder lived through. She writes, "He does not know about the churn, meaning some household routine he should have known and did not." She writes, "He watches Wiley's hands when he eats, and then he eats the same way. He did not use to eat that way." She writes, "He has got my mother's laugh now. He never heard my mother. She died before him." That one stopped me cold the first time I read it. He has got my mother's laugh now. It was not only taking from the household, it was taking from further back. It was reaching past the living people in the room into whatever the room contained. And then, in the entry she dates only first week of Feb, she writes the sentence that gave the entity its shape for me, and, I suspect, for anybody who reads this ledger. She writes, "I have come to think it is not pretending to be him. I think it is making him slow, out of what we give it. It is making him out of what we give it." That is the thesis. That is what Elias Crowder worked out for himself 37 years later, at 9 years old, watching a thing learn to hum a flat note. Now here is where the ledger becomes a warning rather than a record, because Mahala Corbin figured something out in the spring of 1871 that nobody else in this account ever quite states as plainly. She writes, "It is not finished. I have counted the things it has right and the things it has wrong, and the wrong ones is fewer every month." Wiley says, "I am sick in my mind. I am not sick. I am keeping account. That is what I have always done in this book, and I am doing it still. I am keeping account." An account book. She turned an account book into an account of the thing. She counted just like the boy would. That is not a coincidence. It is the only tool a person in that situation has. When you cannot leave and cannot be believed and cannot fight it, you can count it. Counting is the last thing a mind does before it gives up, And it is also, in this case, the only thing that ever worked on this entity at all, and we will get to why. Her last 3 entries are the ones I want to give you nearly whole. The first is undated, in the spring of 1871. She writes, "I asked him tonight to say the blessing the way his daddy says it. He said it word for word, and he said it in his daddy's voice." Wiley laughed. I did not laugh. I have not heard my son's own voice since the 11th of March, and I have been listening. The second is a few pages on. The girls will not sleep upstairs. Cynthia says he counts them at night. I asked her what she means. Counts. She says he stands at the top of the stair and touches each of them on the head and says a number. I told her she has dreamed it. She has not dreamed it. I have seen the marks on the floorboards where he stands. There is a place worn there, and this house is 11-year-old. There is a place worn there, and this house is 11-year-old. A worn place in a floorboard from standing in one spot over and over, long enough to wear the wood. Do you remember the melted ring in the snow at the Crowder doorstep? 36 years later? Something that stands. That is what it does. It stands, and it watches, and it counts, and it learns. And the third entry, the last one. There is nothing after it. The remaining pages of the ledger are blank except for one thing, which I will tell you about in a moment. The last entry reads, "Wiley is going up the hollow in the morning to bring back the other one. He says if one come back, the other can come back. I have told him what I think. I have told him it is not a place that gives things back. It is a place that keeps things and sends something out to fetch the rest." He will not hear me. He says I have gone strange. If I am wrong, then I am a fool, and I will burn this book. If I am right, then whoever finds it should know. And it stops. Mid-sentence. Mid-word almost. Whoever finds it should know, and then nothing. No period. The pen came off the page and did not come back. That is the end of Mahala Corbin's account, and it is the end of the Corbin family in the historical record. The last assessment is 1871. There is no burial record, no probate, no sale of the 60 acres. The land simply reverts and is eventually patented by somebody else in the 1880s. 4 children, 2 parents, 1 mule, and a 60-acre farm at the mouth of a hollow, and the last thing any of them left behind is an unfinished sentence in a tin box in a spring house. I said there was one more thing in the blank pages. On the inside of the back cover of the ledger, in the same hand but much larger, and pressed much harder, hard enough that the letters are visible on the facing page, somebody wrote 4 words. "It knows your name." That is all. No date. No signature. Now, Absalom Crowder walked home from the Corbin place at the end of January, 1908, carrying a tin box. Try to feel the weight of that walk. He is a 38-year-old widowed farmer with a 4th-grade education. He has just spent an afternoon reading a dead woman's handwriting by the light of a doorway with no roof over it, and what he has read is a nearly exact description of the last 6 weeks of his own life, written before he was born. And there is a thing wearing his son sitting at his table 1.25 miles up the creek. He did not tell Elias. He did not tell anybody that night. He put the box under the floor. There was a puncheon in the Crowder cabin that lifted, a common thing where people kept money and papers, and he sat in the chair by the door. Elias Crowder found out about the ledger 3 weeks later, and the way he found out is going to be one of the last pieces of this that falls into place, so hold that. But somebody else found out about it immediately, and that is the part I have been building toward, and it is the single most frightening incident in the entire winter, and it happened on the 2nd night after Absalom brought the box home. Absalom Crowder woke at some point in the small hours in his chair by the door. The fire was low, and the boy Samuel, the thing, whatever noun you want to use, was standing in the middle of the room, not moving, facing the puncheon floor, standing on it, standing on the exact board. Absalom said his name, and it turned around, and it said, "I couldn't sleep, Daddy," and it went back up the ladder to the loft. And Absalom Crowder sat in that chair for the rest of the night with a shotgun across his knees, having understood, finally and completely, and about 6 weeks too late, what he had let into his house. He rode for Jasper at first light. And this is where Sheriff Toll Hask's daybook gives us the third page, and where a rural county sheriff in 1908 sat across a desk from a man he had known for a decade and wrote down, in his own private book, a few plain lines that no lawman ever wants to write. The entry is dated the 1st of February, 1908. It reads, "Ab Crowder came in at 9. He says the boy that came back in December is not his boy. He says he has proof in a book from the Corbin place. I have known this man 11 years, and he has never told me one lie, and I do not believe he is lying now, and I do not know what that leaves me. I do not know what that leaves me." Hask did not laugh at him. That is the thing about Toll Hask. He did not laugh at him, and he did not lock him up, and he did not send for a doctor. He asked Absalom Crowder one question, and it is recorded, and it is the right question, and it is the question that sends this account into its final movement. He said, "Ab, who around here would know about this?" And Absalom Crowder said a name. He said, "Ivorine Lusk." Now, before we go up on Sanders Ridge, and we are going up on Sanders Ridge, and it is worth the climb, I want to take stock of where we are. Because it is the 1st of February, 1908, and there are exactly 24 days left before a mail carrier finds a barefoot child standing in the fog on the road to the Buffalo Crossing. 24 days. In those 24 days, an old woman is going to explain what kind of ground this is in about 6 sentences. A father is going to make a decision that is either the bravest or the stupidest thing in this entire case. A 9-year-old is going to be handed a set of rules that will govern the remaining 73 years of his life. And 2 people are going to go up past the split rock, and one of them is going to come back. And there is one more thing in those 24 days that I have not mentioned at all yet, and I am going to mention it now, and then I am going to leave it alone until it happens, because it is the worst turn in this account, and it deserves its own dark. On the 11th of February, 1908, something knocked on the door of the Crowder cabin at night. From the inside, Sanders Ridge runs about 4 miles, northeast to southwest, on the far side of the creek from the Crowder place. To get to the top of it from the valley floor in 1908, you went up a track that gained something like 600 feet in a mile and a quarter, and you did it on foot or you did it on a mule, and in February you did it in mud. At the top there was a bald and natural clearing, maybe 9 acres, that had been open ground since before white settlement, and probably before that, kept open by the Osage and the Cherokee with fire, the way those balds were kept all through the Ozarks and the southern Appalachians. On the north edge of the bald there was a house. Ivorine Lusk was 78 years old in February of 1908. She had been born in 1829 or 1830 in Carter County, Tennessee, and had come into Newton County as a girl of about 14. She had been married once, to a man named Lusk, who died in 1863, in the war on the wrong side of an argument that split that county in half and never entirely healed. She had no living children. She had a great-nephew who kept her in wood and meal. And she was, in the vocabulary of that time and place, a granny woman, which people today tend to romanticize into something it was not. A granny woman was a midwife and a herbalist and a nurse and a person who sat up with the dying and laid out the dead. It was not a mystical office. It was a medical one, in a county with no doctors, and it was practical and bloody and exhausting, and mostly it was about babies. But there was a second part of the job, and the second part was not written down anywhere, and it was the part where somebody came up a ridge in February with a hat in their hands and asked you about a piece of ground. Ivorine Lusk did not choose that part. She said so plainly. She said her mother's sister, a woman named Delphi Sanders, which is where the ridge got its name, had done it before her, and that Delphi had taught it to her over about 2 years when she was in her 20s, and that she had not wanted it and had said so, and that Delphi had told her that wanting it was not one of the requirements. She said, "There has got to be one. It don't have to be a good one. It just has got to be one that knows." Absalom Crowder and Sheriff Toll Hask went up Sanders Ridge together on the 3rd of February, 1908. That is a detail I love, honestly. The sheriff went. A 46-year-old elected law officer and former mule trader rode up a ridge in the mud to ask a 78-year-old widow about a hollow, and he wrote it in his daybook, in his own hand, where his successors would read it. They took Elias with them. That was Hask's idea, and Elias never forgave him and never stopped being grateful to him, both at once, for the rest of his life. Hask's reasoning, which he gave to Absalom on the way up, was simple. He was not leaving a 9-year-old alone in a house with the thing. They did not take Samuel. They told it they were going to Jasper. It said, "All right, Daddy." Elias said it stood in the yard and watched them go up the far side of the valley, and that it was still standing in the same place, in the same posture, when they went over the top of the ridge 40 minutes later and out of sight. Standing, watching, not moving, 40 minutes. Ivorine Lusk fed them. That is the first thing that happened. 3 people came up out of the mud, and she put cornbread and buttermilk in front of all of them, and did not ask a single question until they had eaten it, because that is how it was done, and because, as she said later, a man will tell you a truer thing on a full stomach. Then she took the boy outside. Just for a minute. She took Elias out into the bald, and she asked him some questions with nobody else there. And Elias Crowder told the folklorist in 1977 that he had never repeated those questions to anyone and was not going to start. Then she came back in, and she sat down, and she said to Absalom Crowder, "How long has it been in your house?" Not, "Is there something?" Not, "Tell me what happened." "How long has it been in your house?" 46 days, he said. And she said, "Then you have got a little time." Not much. Here is what Ivorine Lusk explained to those 3 people over the next 2 hours, and I am going to give it to you in the order she gave it, because the order is part of the argument. She started with the ground. She said, and this is one of those sentences that got repeated in that county for 60 years, and that both Elias Crowder, in 1977, and a completely separate informant, interviewed in 1968, gave in nearly the same words. She said, "Some ground is thick. Most ground is thick. You can stand on it, and it holds you, and it don't take any notice. And some ground is thin, and a thin place don't have to be big. It can be 40 foot across. You can farm all around it your whole life and never step in it." She said the hollow was not thin all over. She said the thin place in it was small, and it was up past the split rock, under the big oaks, which is precisely where the tracks stopped in 1870 and again in 1907. And she said something about the thinness that I have never been able to shake, because it is not the way anybody tells these stories, and the fact that it is not the way anybody tells these stories is one of the reasons I believe this account is genuinely old, rather than invented later. She said the thin place is not a hole. She said everybody thinks it is a hole, and that is why they get it wrong. She said, "It ain't a hole, it's a low spot. Things pool there. Things pool there," not a door to somewhere else. A dip in the ground where whatever moves across a landscape, and she never once said what settles and collects and sits, the way water collects in a low spot in a field. And what pools in that particular low spot, she said, had been pooling for a very long time and had got deep. Then she explained what it does. And this is the part Absalom Crowder had come for. She said, "It does not take people." She was very firm about that. She said, "People walk in, and it does not grab them, and it does not eat them." And she said, and this is a direct quote, preserved twice, "It don't want your boy. It has got no use for a boy. What it wants," she said, "is the shape, the way a person moves, the way they say a word, the way they sit down in a chair. Everything a person is on the outside, which is the only part of a person the world ever actually sees. And it takes the shape by learning it, which is slow, and which is why it needs a household. It cannot learn a man from a man. It has to learn a man from the people who know him. It needs the mother to correct it, and the brother to flinch, and the father to say, 'You don't sound like yourself.' We are not the victims of that process. We are the instruction." Hask asked her the question that a sheriff asks. He asked, "What happens to the person?" And she said, and Elias remembered this exactly, "They're still up there. They're in the low spot. They ain't dead and they ain't living. And I would not go looking to find out which." And Absalom Crowder and I have to imagine this room. The fire, the buttermilk cups, the 9-year-old sitting very still on a bench. Absalom Crowder said, "Then I can get him back." And Ivorine Lusk said, "No." She said it once, and she did not soften it. She said, "The ones who go in after do not come out." And she said, "The going in after is the point." And she said it flatly and cruelly, and it is the most important thing she said all day. She said, "It don't send that thing to your door to sit at your table. It sends it to your door to make you come up there after the other one." Read that again in your head. The entity does not want the household. The household is bait for the rescue. It returns a bad copy specifically because a bad copy sends a father up the hollow. Wiley Corbin went up after his second son in 1871 because the first one came back wrong. The wrongness is not a flaw in the imitation. The wrongness is the hook. Everything Elias noticed, the coat, the scar on the wrong side, the 2-second answers, all of it was doing exactly what it was designed to do. It was making the family certain enough to act and not certain enough to leave. Now, Hask asked the other question. "The one I asked you to hold 60 pages ago?" he asked. "What happens when it finishes learning?" And Ivorine Lusk said 4 words. She said, "Then it can leave." That is the whole cosmology. That is what the thin place is doing. It is deep, and it is full, and it is stuck in a low spot in a hollow in Newton County, Arkansas. And the only way anything gets out of a low spot is if it can walk out, and to walk out it needs legs, and a face, and a name, and a history, and it has to be good enough to buy a rail ticket in Harrison, good enough to be hired on somewhere, good enough that a stranger looking at it across a store counter does not feel their skin move. It had been working on it since at least 1869, 39 years of practice. And in 1907, it finally got a household with 2 children in it, which is the best possible laboratory because children correct you constantly and without mercy, and they do it about the small things that adults have stopped noticing. Elias Crowder was not a witness to that winter. He was the curriculum. Then Ivorine Lusk gave the rules. There were 4. She made the boy say them back to her twice. The first rule, do not answer to your own name after dark. She said it has to have you answer. She said a name is a handle, and it can lift you by it, but only if you take hold of the other end. She said if a voice says your name at night, you say nothing at all. Or, and this is the part that is genuinely useful and genuinely strange, you answer to a name that is not yours. She said, if it calls you Elias, you say, this ain't Elias, this is Tom. Say it out loud. It don't like a wrong name. It has to go back and count again. The second rule, count. And here is where the case does something that I did not expect the first time I worked through it, because it turns out that the nervous habit of a 9-year-old boy, the thing he had been doing since he was 6, the thing the schoolteacher wrote home about because the other children mocked him for it, was not incidental. It was the single most protective thing in this entire account, and Ivorine Lusk did not teach it to him. She recognized it. That is why she took him outside first. She had already seen him do it in the yard, and she came back in and asked his father how long the thing had been in the house, and then, at the end, she turned to the boy and she asked him how long he had been counting. He said, since he was little. And she said, "Then that is why you have still got a face." She explained it as best she could, and her explanation is not scientific and does not pretend to be. She said, the thing works by matching. It watches and it matches. And a person who counts is a person who is doing two things at once, being themselves and running a number underneath. She said it can copy the outside of you all day long, but it cannot copy the number because the number is not on the outside. She said, it can wear you. It can't count, which means every time it comes close, a person who is counting has a piece of themselves that is not available to be taken. There is always one part of you it does not have, and she said that as long as there is one part it does not have, it is not finished with you, and something that is not finished will not act. That is the ritual. That is the whole ritual in this case. No salt, no iron, no prayer, no charm. A frightened child saying numbers out loud in the dark. And then she gave him the flaw. This is the third rule, and it is a rule and a warning at the same time. She said, "But it hears you, boy, every number. It will always know exactly where you are at, and it will come and stand where the counting is, and it will wait for you to stop. Do you understand what that means? The only thing that protects him is also a beacon. He is safe as long as he is counting, and counting tells it precisely which room, which corner, which side of the bed. He can never stop, and nobody can count forever." The fourth rule was the practical one, and it is the one that saved his life on a specific night 23 days later. She said, "If you have got to run, run downhill and run to water, and do not stop for any voice, not your mother's, not your daddy's, and do not go back for anything you have left. It cannot follow you across running water fast. It has got to learn the crossing. That will buy you time. It will not buy you much. Downhill, to water. Do not stop for a voice. Do not go back." And then, according to Elias, she said one more thing that was not a rule, and she said it to Absalom Crowder, and she said it in a completely different tone of voice. She said, "Ab Crowder, I want you to hear the one thing I have said today that nobody ever hears. That house has got 2 children in it. It has got the one it's making, and it has got the one it's learning off of. If you go up that hollow, you leave the live one in a house with the other one." And Absalom Crowder said nothing at all. They went down the ridge at dusk. Tall Hask rode back toward Jasper, and Elias Crowder, on the tape in 1977, said that the last thing the sheriff said to him, leaning down off the horse, to a 9-year-old, at a fork in a muddy road in February of 1908, was, "You keep counting, son. Don't you quit for nobody." Now I want to talk about why nothing ever happened when Hask was on the place, because Ivorine Lusk answered that too, almost in passing, and it is the piece that makes the whole thing cohere. Hask had asked her, half joking, why the thing behaved itself for 2 whole nights while he sat in that cabin, and she said, "Because you wasn't counted," she meant. It works from a complete account. It knows the household, it knows the father, the sons, the dogs, the neighbor, the routine, the sounds the house makes at 11 o'clock. It has an inventory. A stranger in the room is an item it does not have, and it will not move while there is an item it does not have, because it cannot predict what an uncounted thing will do. which tells you why it never touched Cleve Standridge when he watered his team in November, which tells you why it never went near Ora Bellamy's schoolhouse, in a room with 11 children, and only played the copying game when it was invited into a game with rules, and which tells you, horribly, why the safest thing that could have happened to Elias Crowder in February of 1908 would have been for a stranger to move into that house. There were no strangers. There were 3 of them on 80 acres, and one of them was not a person, and it had them all counted. If you are still with me this deep, drop a comment and tell me what you would have done in that room on Sanders Ridge. Go up the hollow, or take the boy and go. There is no right answer. That is why I am asking. Now then, the 11th of February. The knock from the inside. It was a still night, cold and dry, no moon to speak of. Elias woke in the loft sometime after midnight because of a sound he could not place, which is the worst way to wake up in a house you are afraid of. Knocking. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. And his first thought, a 9-year-old's thought, and the correct one, was that something had come up out of the timber and was at the door again. And then he understood that the sound was wrong, because a knock on a door from outside comes through the door, and this was not coming through anything. He got to the edge of the loft and looked down. The fire was down to coals. His father was asleep in the chair with the gun across his knees, head back, mouth open, the way an exhausted man sleeps sitting up. And the boy who was not his brother was standing at the door, on the inside, with his hand raised, knocking on it. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. And between them, quietly, in a small voice, it said, "It's cold, Daddy." Then it changed the voice slightly and said it again. "It's cold, Daddy." Then again, a little different. Then again. Elias Crowder lay on the boards of that loft and watched a thing wearing his brother's body stand at a barred door in the dark and rehearse the sentence that had got it into the house, over and over, trying it different ways, like a man practicing a speech. It was not knocking to get out. It was going over its work. He said, on the tape, that he counted 11 repetitions before it stopped, and that when it stopped, it stood there a while with its hand still on the door, and then it turned around and came back up the ladder, and it climbed past him and lay down on its tick 4 feet away, and its eyes were open, and it lay like that until dawn. He counted. He counted the whole rest of that night. 44 boards, over and over, out loud, under his breath, and he said it did not turn its head once. But the next morning it did something it had never done before. At breakfast, out of nothing, with his father sitting right there, it looked across the table at Elias, and it said a number. It said 44. And then it went back to eating. Now, what happens to a person after that? I want to spend a moment here, because this is the part of these accounts that people skate over. There is a fashion for treating the haunted as a kind of viewer, as though the horror is a thing that happens in front of them and then they react. That is not what this is. Elias Crowder was a 9-year-old child living inside a slow emergency with no exit. And by the middle of February of 1908, the emergency had been going for 8 weeks, and he had not had a full night's sleep in any of them. He described the state to the folklorist in a way that anybody who has ever gone properly sleepless will recognize immediately. He said the daytime got thin. He said he would be carrying water and come to with no memory of the last 200 steps. He said sounds started arriving late. He said he began to be unsure whether he had counted the boards or only thought about counting them, and that this frightened him more than the thing did, because the counting was the only thing he had. And this is the point at which the survival ritual shows its cost, and I want to name that cost clearly, because it is not a small one, and it is not a clever twist. It is the actual mechanism of what this did to him. The counting kept him from being taken. The counting also took him apart. He could not stop, so he did not sleep. He could not sleep, so he could not tell what was real. And every single night, the thing he was hiding from was lying 4 feet away from him, listening to the exact coordinates of his hiding place, because the hiding place was a sound, Ivorine Lusk had told him. It will come and stand where the counting is, and it will wait for you to stop. Now let me give you the middle 2 weeks of February in order, because the escalation in this period is steep, and it is worth watching it climb. The 12th of February. The dog, Peg, was gone from under the house in the morning, and was not found. Nothing unusual by itself. Dogs wander, dogs die. But the 2 hounds would no longer come out from under the house at all, and Absalom Crowder had to pull them out by the collar to feed them, and they would not eat until he shut them back under. The 14th of February. Absalom Crowder took the milk cow and the mule and drove them down to Dob Ellery's and asked him to keep them. He gave no reason. Dob Ellery, keeping his word to the letter, did not ask for one. He took the stock. He also, according to his own later account, walked back up to the road with Absalom and stood there a minute, and then went home without saying anything, and he told his wife Cerilda that night that Ab Crowder's eyes had gone the way a man's eyes go when he has decided something. That is the 14th of February, 10 days out. The 16th of February. This is when Elias found the standing places. He was down at the 90-yard line, the line the dogs would not cross, because his father had sent him to bring up a load of stovewood from a rick at the bottom of the pasture, and he was standing there in the last of the light, and he noticed that the leaf mold in front of him was not right. There were bare places in it, ovals, roughly, 2 feet by 1, more or less the size and shape of the ground a person covers standing with their feet together. The leaf litter was pressed down to the dirt in them, and had not blown back. He counted them. He counted them because he counted everything. There were 22. They ran in a rough arc across the bottom of the pasture, more or less evenly spaced, maybe 8 or 9 feet apart, following the 90-yard line exactly, and every one of them was oriented the same way, toward the house. And here is the part that took Elias Crowder decades to be able to say without his voice changing. Some of them were fresh, clean dirt, sharp edges, and some of them were not. Some of them had moss in them. Some of them had a little cedar seedling growing out of the middle, 4 or 5 inches high, which means the ground had been bare and pressed and undisturbed long enough for a seed to find it and germinate and get through a season. Years. Some of those standing places were years old. The thing had been standing at the bottom of that pasture, looking up at the Crowder house for years before it ever took a boy out of it. 11 years the family had lived there. And it had been down there the whole time, at 90 yards, in the dark, keeping account, counting them, learning the household in the way that a person learns a language they will not need for a long while. That is why the tree line went clean in November. It was not the woods changing, it was the ground being worn. Elias did not tell his father about the standing places. That is a thing he was ashamed of for the rest of his life. And it is a thing that anybody who has ever been a child will understand perfectly. By the 16th of February, he had learned that telling his father things made his father worse. The 18th of February, Absalom Crowder went to the Corbin place again, and he took the boy, he took Elias, not the other one, and he showed him the spring house and the stone shelf, and told him where the tin box had come from. And then he took him into the fallen cabin, into the one corner where the floor was still floor, and showed him something, a worn place in a puncheon board. About 2 feet by 1, down to the soft grain, dished in the middle like the step of a church that has been used for a century. At the top of where a stair would have been, Mahala Corbin had written it in 1871. There is a place worn there, and this house is 11-year-old. Absalom Crowder had read that sentence in January, in that same building, in a doorway with no roof over it, and had gone looking for the floorboard, and had found it. And he said to his 9-year-old son, standing in a ruin at the mouth of that hollow, the sentence that tells you where his mind had gone. He said, "It's been here longer than white people, Eli. It ain't ours. We just built on it." The 20th of February. This is the night with two of them. Elias was in the loft. The thing was on its tick, 4 feet away, and it was breathing, which it did, and did well, and had gotten better at, because in the first week it had breathed too evenly, and now it did not. And from outside, down at the bottom of the pasture, something called his name, Elias, not loud, conversational. The distance was 90 yards, and it came up the pasture like it was said in the room. He said the whole inside of his head went white. He said he had spent 8 weeks afraid of the thing beside him, and it had never once occurred to him, it had never once occurred to anybody, that there could be more than one. And then, in the dark, 4 feet away, his brother's voice said, "You better not answer that." Now, I have listened to that portion of the 1977 recording perhaps 30 times, and I still cannot tell you what that sentence was. Neither could he. He said so. He said he thought about it every day for 69 years and never landed anywhere. Because there are 2 readings. The first reading is that it was a threat, or a taunt, or a test the thing letting him know that it knew, and enjoying it. The second reading is that it was a warning, an actual, sincere warning from something that did not want him to answer. And if it is the second reading, then you have to ask what that means. It means the thing in the loft and the thing in the pasture were not the same, and were not on the same side. It means one of them had a reason to keep him out of the other one's hands. Elias said, "I don't know which it was. I never did. But I'll tell you this. Whatever was down in that pasture calling me, the one laying next to me was afraid of it." He did not answer. He said, out loud, exactly what Ivorine Lusk had told him to say. He said, "This ain't Elias. This is Tom." He said the calling stopped for a while and then started again, and the second time it called him Tom. Let me leave that where it lies. The 22nd of February, Absalom Crowder walked to Dob Ellery's in the afternoon and asked one thing, and it was the only conversation those 2 men had about the subject after the 28th of October, and Dob Ellery kept his word even then. He answered the question, and nothing else. Absalom asked, "Dob, how far up past the rock is the Big Oaks?" And Dob Ellery said, 800 yards. Don't. That is it. That is the entire exchange. And that is the moment when a man who had held out for 11 weeks stopped holding out. The 23rd of February. He put his affairs in order, in the way a farmer with no money and no lawyer does it, which is to say, he wrote 3 sentences on a sheet of paper and put it under the puncheon with the tin box. That paper survives in the same private collection, and it is not dramatic, and it is not a farewell letter. It reads, "If I do not come back, the place goes to Elias Crowder, my son, and Tall Hask is to see to him. There is a book under this board that ought to be burned, but I could not do it. Do not let anybody bring the other boy up out of that hollow. Do not let anybody bring the other boy up out of that hollow." He knew. Whatever else you take from this account, that line makes it plain. Absalom Crowder knew exactly what was in his house, and exactly what he was going to do, and exactly how likely it was to work. He went anyway. Because Ivorine Lusk was right about the hook, and because the hook is not built out of stupidity, it is built out of the one thing in a parent that does not have an off switch. The 24th of February, 1908, was a Monday. It was overcast and warm for the season, in the 50s, with fog in the bottoms in the morning that did not burn off until nearly noon. Absalom Crowder woke his younger son before daylight. He took him down to the barn, which was the one building on that place the thing did not go into after the cow kicked the stall out in January, and he gave him a set of instructions, And Elias Crowder repeated those instructions to a tape recorder 69 years later, without a single hesitation, which is what happens when a 9-year-old is given the last thing his father ever says to him. Absalom said, "I am going up the hollow. I will be back by dark. If I am not back by dark, you do not wait, and you do not look for me, and you do not go in that house again for any reason. You go straight down the creek to Dob Ellery's, and you tell him I said to take you to Tolhask." And then he said, "If it calls you, you count, out loud, all the way to Ellery's. Don't quit." And then he said the thing that I think about, honestly, more than any other line in this case. He said, "Son, if I come back down out of there, and I ain't right if you look at me, and you know you run, don't you dare stay for me. You run." And Elias Crowder, 9 years old, said, "Yes, sir." And his father went up the hollow. Here is what a 9-year-old does with a day like that. He did chores. That is the answer. He did chores because there was nothing else to do with his hands, and because his father had told him to be at the barn, and the barn had work in it. He cleaned a stall that did not need cleaning. He carried water he did not need. He mended a hame-strap badly, and he counted. And he watched the mouth of the hollow across the valley, which he could not actually see from the barn, but he watched the notch in the ridge above where it was, which is what people do. The fog burned off around noon. The afternoon was gray and mild. He said there were birds in the morning and no birds after about 2 o'clock, and he noticed it because the silence made him check the sun. The thing did not come out of the house all day. That is worth saying twice. From before daylight until dusk on the 24th of February, 1908, the boy in the house did not come out of it once. Elias could see the door from the barn lot. The door did not open. No smoke came out of the chimney after mid-morning, which means it let the fire go out, and it had never let the fire go out. It was waiting. It knew what day it was. Of course it knew what day it was. It had been in the room when Absalom Crowder made up his mind. Dark comes early on the 24th of February at that latitude. Sunset about 6:15, full dark by 7. At about 5, with the light going flat and gray, Elias Crowder heard his father call his name from the direction of the creek. He was not ready for it. He said that in 70 years he never forgave himself for not being ready for it, which is an absurd thing for a man to hold against a 9-year-old, and which is exactly the kind of thing people hold against themselves. Because his first reaction was joy. He got 3 steps out of the barn lot before he stopped, and the reason he stopped is the reason he lived. He stopped because he could not see it. Rule 1. Do not answer a voice you cannot see. Dob Ellery, on a rainy porch in October. The creek bottom was in shadow, and the fog was already coming back up out of it the way it does in that country in the evening, and the voice was down in that, and there was no man visible anywhere in 200 yards of open pasture. His father called again. He said his father's voice sounded tired and glad and completely, perfectly right. And Elias Crowder stood in a barn lot in the last light and said, out loud, to his own dead or worse father, "This ain't Elias, this is Tom." The calling stopped. And then, 20 or 30 seconds later, it said, "All right, Tom, come on down here." He went into the barn, and he shut the door, and he sat down against the inside of it, and he counted, and he did not come out. Now, full dark, 7 o'clock, more or less. He had his instructions. If I am not back by dark, you do not wait, and you do not look for me, and you do not go in that house again for any reason. You go straight down the creek to Dob Ellery's, and he was going to do exactly that. He said so, and I believe him, and it does not matter, because of one thing. It was February, and it was going to be down near freezing by midnight, and he had no coat. His coat was in the house. There it is. That is the whole hinge of the night. 9 years old, a mile and a half of creek road in the dark, temperature dropping, and the coat is on a peg by a cold fireplace 40 feet away. He went in. Here is how he did it. And I want to give you this in his own structure, because the tape is very precise here in a way it is not anywhere else, and precision. In a 79-year-old man's memory of a night when he was 9, tells you how many thousands of times he has walked through it. He went out the back of the barn and around the north side of the house, away from the door, keeping the building between himself and the pasture. There were 2 windows, both on the south. He came around the east gable at the chimney where the stone was, and he stood in the corner of the chimney and the wall and listened. Nothing. He counted. Out loud, quiet. He said he did the fence rails 206 because it was a longer count than the ceiling boards, and he wanted the long one. He went in the door. The fire was dead, not low, dead, gray, cold, and he said the room was colder than outside and it smelled wrong. He described the smell, and the description is one word: creek. It smelled like creek, like wet limestone and cold water and leaf. Inside, a shut house. He got to the fireplace. He got his hand on his coat, and his coat was not on the peg. Both his coat and his brother's coat had been moved. They were hanging on the north wall. Outside, on the north wall of the porch, in the cold, the way his mother had made them do it for years, and the way nobody had done it since October, and the way his father had never once resumed doing it in all those months. Something in that house had, at some point that day, taken the coats off the pegs by the fire and hung them on the cold north wall. It had gotten it right. It had finally gotten the coat right. 10 weeks. It had taken it 10 weeks to learn the thing that a boy would have raised the roof about on the first morning, and it learned it on the day it was finished with them. Elias Crowder said that was the moment he understood he was going to die if he stayed there another minute, and it was also, and he was very clear about this, the moment he stopped counting. That is the failure. That is the flaw showing itself at the worst possible time, and it does not fail because of a monster or a trick. It fails because a 9-year-old boy saw a coat hanging in the right place, and his mind went completely blank. He stood in that room in the dark, in the cold, in the smell of the creek, and he did not say a number for what he estimated was 10 or 15 seconds. And in that silence, from the loft above him, something said, Elias, his own name. Out of the dark, from directly overhead, he said he did not remember going out the door. He remembered the doorstep, and then he remembered being at the bottom of the pasture, which is 200 yards, barefoot, in February, and he had no memory of any of it. He never got the coat off the north wall. He said later he must have grabbed one, going past the post. That is his only guess, because when Pearl Denton found him 34 hours later, he was wearing his brother's wool coat, the big one, the one that had hung on that peg since October, and he had no memory of taking it. Now, the run, downhill and to water, and do not stop for a voice. Rule 4, Ivorine Lusk, Sanders Ridge. He went down the pasture and hit the creek road and turned downstream toward Dob Ellery's, a mile and a half, and he ran it and he counted the whole way, out loud, the 206 rails over and over, and he said he could hear himself doing it, and his voice sounded like somebody else's. He got to Ellery's Inn, he guessed a quarter of an hour. There was a light in the window. There was smoke. There was a dog barking, which he said was the best sound he had ever heard in his life, because a dog barking means a dog is willing to be outside. He came up the last of the lane, and he was 50 feet from that porch, and through the door, which was shut, he heard Dob Ellery's voice. Dob Ellery said, "Ab, where's the boy at?" And a voice answered him. Elias Crowder, 79 years old, in 1977, stopped the tape here. Not literally the tape runs, but he stopped. And it is 11 seconds of nothing but a man breathing, and then he says, "It was my daddy." It was my daddy's voice, and it was my daddy's laugh, and it wasn't but 4 hours since he went up in there, and it already had him. 4 hours. The first time, in 1870, it took months. With Samuel, in 1907, it took 65 days. It took Absalom Crowder in an afternoon, because it did not have to build him from nothing. It had been sitting at that man's table for 10 weeks, watching him eat, watching him grieve, being corrected by him, being taught by him every single day. It had the whole file. It had been given the whole file. Absalom Crowder walked up that hollow, carrying everything it needed. Elias did not go up onto the porch. He said he wanted to more than he had ever wanted anything. He said he got as far as putting 1 foot on the bottom step, and then he thought about what would happen if he went in that door, and Dob Ellery said, "There he is," and it turned around. So he went back down the lane, and he kept going downstream, and he left the only 2 adults within 4 miles behind him in a lit house. And he did not warn them, and he never stopped thinking about that either. I want to say plainly, Dob Ellery was fine. So was Cyrilda. Whatever was in that house that night ate supper and left before midnight and did not harm either of them, and Dob Ellery told Tall Hask 2 days later that Ab Crowder had come by and asked after the boy and had seemed worn out but easy in himself, and that he had thought nothing of it, and that when he learned what he had been sitting across a table from, he took to his bed for a week. Whatever it wanted, it did not want them. Ivorine Lusk had been right about that too. It has no use for a boy or a neighbor or a wife or a sheriff. It wanted the one that was not finished. So, 11 miles. The creek road from the Crowder place runs generally southeast and then east, dropping toward the Buffalo River, and in 1908 it was a wagon track that forded the creek 4 times in the first 6 miles, because it was easier to cross the water than to cut a road along a bluff. 4 crossings. In February, at night, barefoot. That is where the cuts on his feet came from, not from the road. Creek gravel is rounded, but there is limestone shelf in those crossings, and there is ice at the edges in February, and ice at the edge of a ford is a knife. He crossed the water 4 times, because Ivorine Lusk had told him it could not follow across running water fast. It had to learn the crossing. And here is the detail that tells you the old woman was giving him real information and not comfort. It kept up anyway. It just fell behind at each ford and caught up in between. He heard it the whole night. That is the part I find hardest to sit with. Not a chase in the dark, an 11-mile conversation. It called him Alias, and he said, "This is Tom," and it called him Tom. It called him with his father's voice for the first few miles. Then, after the second ford, it started using his brother's. Then, and this is around the middle of the night by his reckoning, it used his mother's, and it hummed, and it got the 4th note flat by exactly the right amount. He said that was the only time he came near answering. And late, very late, in the coldest part before dawn, when he had been walking rather than running for hours because a 9-year-old cannot run 11 miles, it used his own. It called him with his own voice. He said it said, "I'm cold." He said he counted right through it. He said he had started over so many times by then that he had lost the rails and the boards and was just counting numbers, straight up, from 1. And that every time he crossed water he started over at 1, and that at the last ford he was somewhere past 2,000. And after the last crossing, he said, it did not catch up again. Not because it could not. He was very clear on that. He said the reason was simpler and worse. He said the road came up out of the creek bottom onto the ridge road there, and the ridge road was the mail route, and there were 3 houses on it inside a mile. He had walked into a place where there were people it had not counted. Pearl Denton was 33 years old and had carried that mail route for 6 years. He came around the bend at about 20 minutes to 7 on the morning of Sunday, the 26th of February, 1908. In fog so thick, he said he heard the boy before he saw him. He heard counting. A child's voice in the fog on an empty road at first light, saying numbers. He got down. He said the boy's name. He knew the family the way a mail carrier knows everybody, and the boy did not answer and did not look at him and kept counting. And Denton said he had got to 400 and something. He had started over again. Of course he had. He had started over at every crossing for 2 days, and he had started over one more time when he came up onto the ridge, and he was going to keep starting over for the rest of his life. Denton put him up on the horse and finished his route, with a silent 9-year-old sitting in front of him in a coat 3 sizes too big. And then he turned north and rode to Jasper, and it took him the better part of the day, and he got there a little after dark. They put the boy in the back room of the courthouse, where there was a stove. They gave him a plate. He did not eat it. He would not sit with his back to the door. That detail is in the daybook, and it is in Ora Bellamy's letter of the 3rd of March, and it is in the oral history from 3 directions, and it is the first appearance of something that lasted 73 years. And Sheriff Marion Tolliver Hask sat down across from him and said, "All right, son, tell me." And Elias Crowder told him, "The daybook entry for the 26th of February, 1908, is the longest in the surviving pages. It runs most of the page, and the hand gets smaller and tighter as it goes down, the way a man's hand does when he does not want the words to be as big as they are. Most of it is procedural. Denton's account, the boy's condition, the dispatch of 2 men to the Crowder, place at first light, the note that Dob Ellery is to be brought in. And then there are 4 sentences. They are the 4 sentences I have been holding since the beginning of this, and here they are, exactly as they are written. He says his brother came back in December, and it was not his brother. He says his father went up after the right one Monday, and did not come down. He says his brother came down instead, and is wearing his father. I asked him what it wants now, and he said, me. I asked him what it wants now, and he said, me. Sit with that a second. A sheriff, a stove, a plate of food going cold, and a 9-year-old boy who would not put his back to a door explaining, calmly, in the flat voice of a child too tired to be frightened any more, that the thing had collected his mother's humming and his brother's face and his father's laugh, and that he was the last item on the list. He was not being dramatic. He was doing arithmetic. He had been doing arithmetic all winter. He had counted the standing places at the bottom of the pasture, and he had counted the seconds before an answer, and he had counted his own footsteps across 4 fords in the dark, and he had arrived at a total, and the total was that there had been 4 people in that house in 1906, and he was the only one left outside the hollow. Now, let me tell you what they found. At first light, on the 27th of February, 1908, 2 deputies, a man named Ort Stanley and a man named Cass Pruitt, rode out from Jasper with Pearl Denton showing them the road. They picked up Dob Ellery on the way, who went, and who by every account did not want to and went anyway, which I think buys that man a great deal. They reached the Crowder place a little after noon. The door was standing open, not broken, open and swung all the way back against the wall, the way a door is when somebody walks out of a house and does not intend to come back to it. The fire was long cold. There was cornbread on the table, dried out, and 2 plates. 2 plates. Set. As though somebody had laid the table for 2, and then not eaten. The stock was gone from the lot, but the stock had been at Ellery's since the 14th, so that was nothing. The 2 hounds were still under the house and would not come out. And Ort Stanley eventually pulled them out and put them on a rope and took them back to Jasper. And both of those dogs, according to Stanley, would not go into a building for the rest of their lives and had to be kept tied in a yard. In the loft there were 2 ticks 4 feet apart. One was disturbed, one was smooth. And on the north wall of the porch, in the cold, on the peg, hung one small wool coat boy's size, 9 years old, hung neatly, squared on the peg, Elias Crowder's own coat. The one he had gone into that house for. Something had hung it up there for him and left it hanging. They lifted the puncheon and found the tin box and the sheet of paper with 3 sentences on it. And Ort Stanley put the whole business in a saddlebag and carried it back to Tall Hask. And that is how the ledger of Mahala Corbin entered the possession of the sheriff of Newton County, where it stayed until 1941, and after that stayed in his family, and where it substantially remains. Now, the search. This is where I have to slow down again, because what happened in the first week of March, 1908, is the only time in the entire documented history of that hollow that a large, organized group of men went up past the split rock in daylight, and it is the only reason we have any physical description of the place at all. Tall Hask raised 24 men. That is an enormous number for that county. They came from Cane Ridge and Jasper and from 4 different creeks, and a fair share of them came because Ab Crowder was known and liked, and a fair share came because they had heard the boy's story second-hand within 72 hours, and had come to see for themselves, which is human, and which I do not begrudge them. They went up on the 2nd of March, cold, clear, hard ground. They went in a line, in daylight, 24 men with dogs and guns and a county sheriff, and every single one of them knew the local rule, and every single one of them broke it, because that is what 24 men do that one man will not. The dogs quit at the split rock. All of them. Every dog in the party sat down at the split rock and would not be dragged, and 2 of them slipped their collars and went home. The men went on. 800 yards up from the rock, the hollow opens out. That is the geography. The drainage narrows through a rock fall and then flattens into a bench, maybe 2 acres in extent. On the north side, under a stand of very large white oak, Hask estimated the largest of those trees at better than 4 feet through, which puts them at 300 years old or more, and which means that stand was old growth that had never been cut in a county that had been logging hard for 30 years. Nobody had ever cut that timber. 4-foot white oak, 800 yards from a road, in 1908, when tie contractors were stripping every hollow in the Ozarks. Nobody had cut it. On that bench, they found 3 things. The first thing was the leaves. The Ozark floor in March is ankle-deep in oak leaf. It is the defining texture of that country. You cannot walk quietly in it, and you cannot see the ground through it. There is a place on that bench, roughly circular, that Hask paced at about 40 feet across, where there were no leaves. Not blown clear, not washed. The ground inside that circle was bare, packed, smooth, and slightly dished lower in the middle by maybe a foot, like the floor of a barn that has been swept for a century. Nothing growing in it, not moss, not a seedling, not a blade. And around it, right up to the edge, ankle-deep leaf litter like everywhere else. Ivorine Lusk had said it a month before, and none of those men had heard her say it. It ain't a hole, it's a low spot. Things pool there. The second thing was the standing places. Around the rim of that circle, facing inward, were the bare oval patches. The same shape Elias Crowder had counted 22 of at the bottom of his father's pasture. Cass Pruitt tried to count them. He gave it up somewhere past 200. They were not only around the rim, they were up the slope behind it, and out along the bench, and in among the oaks, in rows and in arcs, and in no order at all, some of them fresh, and some of them with cedar growing 4 feet high out of the middle of them, which puts those at 20 years or better. 24 grown men stood on a 2-acre bench in Newton County, Arkansas, and understood, all at once, that they were standing in a place where something had been standing still for a very long time. Several of them left. That is recorded. 4 men walked out of that hollow on the 2nd of March, 1908, and would not go back in, and one of them, a man named Lem Bollinger, moved his family to Oklahoma inside the year. The third thing was in the middle of the circle, a pair of boys' shoes, set side by side, squared up, toes pointing down the hollow toward the mouth, toward the way out. They were Samuel Crowder's shoes. He had taken them off somewhere on the afternoon of the 15th of October, 1907, and they had never been found, and they had been sitting in the middle of that swept circle for 139 days, out in the weather, through 6 inches of snow and 19 days of hard freeze, and a wet January. They were dry. Hask wrote that down. He wrote, "Shoes dry." They found no sign of Absalom Crowder. Not that day, and not on the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th. They searched that hollow and the two either side of it for 4 days with 20 men, and they found nothing at all. No clothing, no remains, no track, no fire, no shelter, nothing that a missing man leaves behind. They found no sign of the boy who had come back in December either. Whatever had been sleeping in that loft since the 19th and had hung a coat on a north wall on the 24th was simply gone off the face of the county. On the 6th of March, 1908, Sheriff Marion Tolliver Hask closed the search, and in the official record, the docket, the county paper, the thing that outsiders would read the disposition on Absalom Crowder is 3 words long, lost in timber. That is the wrong word on the paper. That is what I meant at the very start of this, when I said every one of these cases gets signed off with the wrong word. Not a lie, a container, a phrase a county can live inside. Because here is what Toll Hask actually thought. And we know what Toll Hask actually thought, because he wrote one more entry, and it is the 4th and last page I have seen, and it is dated the 6th of March, 1908, and it is 19 words long. I have wrote lost in timber. That is not what happened to him. There is nothing else I can write. Now let me clear the board, because there are 7 people in this account, and I owe you an accounting of all of them. Ora Bellamy finished the winter term at Cane Ridge and did not return the following year. She wrote her sister on the 3rd of March, 1908, a letter that is mostly practical, and near the end of it, she writes about the Crowder matter, in a way I want to give you because it is the only contemporary description we have of what that county was like in the week after. She writes that the school had 11 pupils in February and has 7 in March. She writes that 2 families have gone to relatives and 1 has gone to Oklahoma. She writes that the children will not go home alone and that fathers are coming to fetch them, which she says has not happened before in her time there. And she writes one line about the boy who is gone. They do not say his name here. I asked a woman why, and she said, "It is not that we are afraid, it is that we do not want to be heard saying it. We do not want to be heard saying it." Which brings me, finally, to the word. I told you at the start of this that the people who lived within a day's walk of that hollow did not generally call it Corbin Hollow, and that they had another name for it, and that I was holding the word back because of how the boy used it, and because of what happened to the second man who used it in front of the sheriff. I have made you wait about 2.5 hours for it. Here it is. They called it the borrow ground. That is all. That is the whole word. It is not sinister on its face, and that is exactly why it stayed in use for 80 years without any outsider ever noticing it. A borrow pit, in the vocabulary of anybody who has ever built a road or a rail grade or a levee, is a place you dig material out of to use somewhere else. You borrow the dirt. It is a completely ordinary piece of working language, and in a county where half the men had cut ties or graded road at some point, nobody hearing it would look up. But that is not what they meant. Elias Crowder used it once on the 1977 tape, in passing, without explaining it, the way you use a word you have known since before you could read. He said, "Daddy never called it Corbin. He called it the borrow ground, and he said, don't go on it." And the second use is in Sheriff Toll Hask's daybook. In the entry of the 26th of February, 1908, the long one, the one with the 4 sentences, and it is not the boy who says it. Dob Ellery was brought into Jasper on the 27th. He gave his statement about the light in the window and the voice at his table. And at the end of it, according to Hask, he was asked where Absalom Crowder had gone on the 24th. And Dob Ellery, who had promised in October that he would speak of it 3 times and then never again, and who had kept that promise through the whole winter, and who had just spent a night discovering what he had passed the cornbread to, said, "He went up on the borrow ground, and then he put his hands over his face and did not speak again for some time." Hask wrote it down and underlined it, which he does nowhere else on any page I have seen. He underlined 2 words in 11 years of a daybook. Here is why I think he underlined them. Because borrow is not take. A thing that takes is a thing you can hate cleanly. A thing that takes is a robbery, and a robbery has an end to it. Borrowing is a relationship. Borrowing implies a period of use and an intention to return, and it implies that the thing borrowed comes back, changed, worn, carrying somebody else's marks, but back. It came back in 1870. It came back in December of 1907. It came back up a walk in the frost in Harrison in 1979. That is the local theology of that hollow, worked out over generations by people with no vocabulary for it and no help coming, and compressed into 2 syllables that a stranger could stand in a store and hear 10 times and never once flinch at. They did not think the ground stole people. They thought it was using them and would be bringing them back. Ora Bellamy taught in Fayetteville and later in Rogers, married in 1914, had 3 children, and died in 1961 at the age of 79. Her letters were donated by a granddaughter in 1984. There is no evidence she ever spoke about Newton County again. Dob Ellery kept his word about not discussing it, right up until he could not. He died in 1913, 5 years later, of what the record calls dropsy, which in 1913 usually means heart failure. He was 57, and in the last week of his life he sent for a preacher named Hollis Vint, and he talked to that man for the better part of an afternoon, and Hollis Vint would not repeat what was said in it except for one thing, which he repeated for the rest of his life. He said Dob Ellery told him, "I sat at a table with it and I never knowed. It eat my wife's cooking and it said grace." It said grace. Cyrilda Ellery outlived him by 19 years. Ivorine Lusk died in the winter of 1911 at 81 or 82 on Sanders Ridge, in the house she had lived in for 50 years. She was, according to the great-nephew who found her, sitting up in a chair facing the door, which people made a great deal of at the time, and which I declined to make anything of, because a great many old women die in chairs, and every chair faces something. But I will give you one thing about Ivorine Lusk, and it is the last thing anybody recorded her saying about this business, and it was said in 1910 to a woman who had come up the ridge about an entirely different matter, and had asked, on her way out, about the Crowder business, the way people do. Ivorine Lusk said, "They think it lost. It didn't lose. It got done. It got done." Pearl Denton carried mail on that route until 1929. He told the story perhaps 4 times in his life. He always told it the same way, and he always ended it the same way, which was, he was counting, and I have never in my life been so glad to hear a child make a noise. He died in 1951. The Crowder place was never lived in again. That is not folklore. That is a title record. 80 acres on the bench above Dunlap Creek passed out of the family in 1911 and was bought by a timber company out of Missouri, along with a great deal of surrounding ground, and the timber company cut everything on it except one stand. They did not cut the big white oaks on the bench past the split rock. There is no note in the company records explaining why. Old-growth white oak was the single most valuable thing in that county in that decade. They cut ridge after ridge, and they went around 2 acres. The Crowder cabin stood empty until the summer of 1919, when it burned. The cause is not recorded. There is a line in the Newton County paper of the period noting the fire in one sentence, and the sentence includes the phrase, "no loss," which, for a standing house on improved land, is an odd thing to print. Most of that ground is inside the Buffalo National River boundary today, or on National Forest, and the roads that went there are not roads anymore. The split rock is still there. I have not been to it, and I am not going to tell you how to find it, and I want to be honest that my reason is not entirely rational. And Sheriff Marion Tolliver Hask served 2 more terms until 1913, and then did not run again, and went back to trading mules, and lived until 1941, and died at 79. And he and his wife Delphia Hask, who had no children, took in a 9-year-old boy in the first week of March, 1908, and raised him. That is the part of this that I hold on to. In an account with this much dark in it, a childless couple in Jasper, Arkansas, made a room for a boy who would not sleep and would not sit with his back to a door, and counted out loud all night long, and they did it for 9 years. And they never once, according to him, told him to stop counting. Elias Crowder lived in that house until he was 18. And on the 26th of February of every single year for the rest of his life, the anniversary of the fog and the road and the mail carrier, Elias Crowder did not leave his house after dark. 73 of them. Now, I want to give you the last part of this, which is his life. Because the thing about a case like this is that we tend to stop the camera when the child gets to safety, and the child then has to go on and be a person for 73 more years. And there is a night in 1979 that I have been saving since the beginning. Now, before we go on to what happened after, and there is a good deal after, and some of it is recent, I owe you an accounting of the other files, because the Crowder case is not the only paper on that hollow, and I would be doing you a disservice if I let you think it was. There are 3 more. I will give them to you briefly and in order, and I will tell you honestly which of them I think is worth anything. The first is from 1929. In the autumn of that year, a civilian-era survey party, this is before the Corps work of the 30s, a state timber inventory, ran a line through the general area, and one of the field notebooks from that survey is in a state archive. It is dry stuff, chain lengths and species tallies, and there is one interruption in it. On a page dated the 4th of November, 1929, the recorder writes that the party made camp on a bench, and that the crew chief, whom he names only by initials, moved them at 11 o'clock at night, in the dark, downhill and off the bench, over the objections of every man in the party, and would not say why. The recorder writes, "He would not give a reason, and I have not asked for one. We lost half a day, that is all." No mention of the circle, no mention of anything heard or seen. A crew chief who moved a camp in the dark and would not say why. Take it for what it is. But I note that it is the same hollow, and that nobody moves a camp at 11 at night in 1929 for fun. The second is from 1954, and it is the one I do not think is worth much, and I am going to tell you why, because I would rather show you my reasoning than only show you the parts that help. In August of 1954, a Harrison newspaper ran a short piece about a hunting party that got separated on National Forest ground in that quarter of the county, and one member of which, a man in his 30s, from out of state, was missing for a night, and was recovered the following afternoon, disoriented, about 4 miles from where he was expected. He gave an account that mentioned hearing his own name. The reason I do not lean on it is that it is 1954, in a county where this story had been in circulation for 46 years, told to a reporter by a man who had almost certainly heard some version of it in the 2 days he had been in the area. I include it because leaving it out would be dishonest, not because it proves anything. The third one is different, And the third one is the reason I take the 1968 material seriously. In the summer of 1968, a regional folklore project, the same broad effort that would eventually put a graduate student in Elias Crowder's front room, 9 years later, interviewed an elderly woman in the southeast of the county about granny woman practice. She was in her late 80s. She was not a Crowder, not a Lusk, not an Ellery, and she is not connected to any of the families in this account. She was asked a standard question about places that were avoided, and she said, on tape, in 1968, "Some ground is thick and some ground is thin. A thin place don't have to be big." Almost word for word what Ivorine Lusk said in a house on a bald in February of 1908 to 3 people, one of whom was a 9-year-old boy who would not repeat it to anybody for 69 years. That is the finding that changed how I read this whole case. Because those 2 recordings, 1968 and 1977, sat in the same collection for decades without anybody putting them side by side, and they were given by 2 people who did not know each other in different decades in answer to different questions. It means the cosmology is real in the only sense I can actually demonstrate. Not that the thing is real, that the belief is old and local and shared and phrased in a fixed form and was in circulation among people in that county long before anybody was writing it down for entertainment. Somebody, at some point, worked out a way to say this so that it could be handed on. And then it was handed on, quietly, from woman to woman, for at least 60 years and probably a great deal longer, in the way that dangerous practical knowledge is always handed on in places where there is no one else to hand it to you. Some ground is thick, some ground is thin. A thin place does not have to be big. You can farm all around it your whole life and never step in it. But before 1979, there is 1911, and I have been holding that one too. In August of 1911, 3.5 years, after a man named Farrell Kittrell, who had known Absalom Crowder for a decade and had bought hogs off him twice, was in Harrison, Arkansas, 31 miles north of Jasper. On the day of the week, the train came in. Harrison had a depot. Harrison was where the rail was. Harrison was the place a person went when they were leaving Newton County for good, and there was exactly one way out of that country by rail, and that depot was it. Farrell Kittrell said he saw Absalom Crowder standing on the platform. He said the man was clean-shaven and in a good coat and had a case in his hand, and he said he crossed the street to speak to him and got about halfway and stopped. He never said why he stopped. He was asked, and he never said. He said only that he stood in the street and looked at him for a good while, and that the man on the platform turned and looked back at him, and that the man on the platform smiled and raised his hand. And Farrell Kittrell went back the way he had come. Now, I want to be extremely careful here, because this is the exact point where an account like this can tip over into something I do not want to hand you. Farrell Kittrell was one man. He was at a distance. He had known Absalom Crowder casually, not intimately. 3.5 years had passed. People see the dead in crowds. That is one of the most reliably documented experiences in the whole of human grief, and it happens to skeptics and believers alike, and it does not require anything to be true except a face at the wrong distance. It is also true that Absalom Crowder could simply have walked out. That is the most boring explanation, and it deserves its hearing. A widower loses one son, loses his mind a little, abandons the other, and starts again 3 counties over under a different name. That happens. It happened constantly in 1908. It is, statistically, the likeliest thing on this entire list. Hold all of that, and then hold this. Ivorine Lusk, in February of 1908, sitting in a house on Sanders Ridge, was asked what the thing was working toward, and she answered in 4 words. Then it can leave. The whole project, 39 years of it, at minimum, and probably centuries, was to become a person good enough to be a person somewhere else, not to haunt a hollow, to get out of it. And the last thing it collected, on the afternoon of the 24th of February, 1908, was a 38-year-old man with a full set of adult memories, a trade, a voice, a walk, and a deed to 80 acres. A grown man can buy a ticket. A 12-year-old boy cannot. 3.5 years later, something that looked exactly like that man was standing on the only platform out of that country with a case in its hand. I am not going to tell you what to do with that. I am going to put it down on the table and leave it there and move on, and if it follows you around for a few days, well, that is what it does. Now, Elias Crowder's life. He was raised in Jasper by the sheriff and his wife. He went to school through the 8th grade, which in Newton County in that era was more than most. He worked in a store. In 1918, at the age of 20, he enlisted, and he was in France for 4 months at the end of the war in a supply company. And he never saw combat, and he told people for the rest of his life that France had been the easiest sleeping of his life. Think about that sentence. A man told people that a war zone was where he slept best. He explained it once to his son, and the explanation is one of the sanest things in this whole account. He said, "Over there was somebody awake all night, always, every night. In every place he stayed, somewhere in that camp, a man was standing a watch with his eyes open." He said, "I never in my life felt as safe as I did in a place where somebody was always counting the dark for me." He came home in 1919. He married a woman named Cordy Fenn in 1923. They had 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, and he worked for the Highway Department in Boone County from 1928 until he retired in 1963. 35 years grading and maintaining roads, which meant he spent his working life outdoors in daylight in company with other men, and I do not think for a second that was accidental. He was, by all accounts, a good father, a quiet man, a bad singer, and a person of enormous and unvarying routine. And here are the marks. This is what 73 years of it looked like from the outside, described by the people who lived with him and who did not know a single thing about Newton County in 1908 because he did not tell them. He never told his wife. He never told his children. Not one word of it until 1977, when he was 79 years old, and even then he told a stranger with a tape recorder rather than his own family, which is a thing I have thought about a great deal and which I suspect anyone who has carried something for a long time will understand immediately. So his family did not get a story. They got a set of behaviors with no explanation attached. He barred doors. Every door in every house he ever lived in had a bar on it, hickory, in 2 brackets made by him, and he replaced them when they wore. His daughters grew up thinking this was normal, discovered in adolescence that no other house in Harrison had one, and were told, when they asked, "That's just how I do." He would not sit with his back to a door. In a restaurant he would wait for the right table. His son said that in 50 years he never once saw his father take a seat facing away from a room. He counted. Out loud, quietly, under his breath, when he was tired or worried or in the dark, and constantly at night. His wife said she went to sleep to it for 41 years, and that when he was away, she could not sleep for the quiet. His youngest daughter, interviewed in the 1990s by a local historical society, said the sound of her father counting in the next room was the sound of her childhood, and that she still counted herself to sleep and had taught it to her own children without ever once telling them why. 3 generations. Started by a 9-year-old in a loft in 1907 because an old woman on a ridge told him it was the one part of him the thing could not take. He would not answer to his name in the dark. This is the one his family found the strangest, and it is the one that gets me, because it is the rule intact unchanged, ported forward across 70 years into a house with electric lights and a television in it. If you called for Elias Crowder at night, from another room, from the porch, from the yard, he did not answer. He came. He would get up and walk to where you were and put his eyes on you, and then he would speak, but he would not answer a voice through a wall or a door or across a dark yard, ever. And his children learned, as small children, not to shout for Daddy at night, because Daddy would not shout back. And they thought it was a game, and then they thought it was a quirk, and then they thought nothing of it at all, because that is what families do with the strangeness of the people they love. His son said, "You had to go stand in front of him. He had to see your mouth." Dobb Ellery, on a rainy porch, the 28th of October, 1907. If you can't see the mouth it's coming out of, you don't answer it. And there was one more. And it is the smallest and the worst. He would not let anybody hum in his house, not a rule anybody enforced, and not a thing he ever said angrily. His wife said that in the first year of their marriage she was humming over the wash, and he came in from outside and stood in the door, and he did not say anything, and she stopped, and she never did it again, and she never asked, and in 41 years of marriage it never came up in words, even once. Now, the tape. In the late summer of 1977, a graduate student doing field work on Ozark narrative collecting ballads and tale types, the tail end of a tradition of folklore collection that had been going in those hills since the 1920s, was given Elias Crowder's name by somebody at a church in Harrison as an old-timer who might know some songs. He went out on a Tuesday afternoon with a reel-to-reel and a list of questions about ballads. Elias Crowder was 79. His wife Cordy had died in 1974. He was living alone in a small house on the north side of Harrison. He made the young man coffee, and the young man asked his standard opening question, which was, "What is the first thing you remember?" And Elias Crowder talked for 51 minutes. The student did not interrupt except 4 times. You can hear him not interrupting. You can hear a 24-year-old realizing about 6 minutes in that he has walked into something he was not remotely prepared for and deciding, correctly, to shut up and let the tape run. That recording sat in a university collection, cataloged under a general heading, unremarked, for a very long time. It is not a famous document. It is one reel among thousands, and the reason anybody ever went back to it is that a researcher in the 2000s cross-referenced an oral history index against the Bellamy letters and noticed a name. I said at the beginning that there is a place about 31 minutes in where he stops for 11 seconds, and that what he says afterward is the worst sentence in this case. We are there now. The context is this. He has just finished describing the night of the 20th of February, the night his own name was called from the bottom of the pasture, while the thing lay breathing 4 feet away from him, and the thing said, "You better not answer that." And the student, who has been silent for a long time, asks a question. He asks it gently. He asks, "Do you think it was your brother, at all? Any part of it?" And Elias Crowder does not answer for 11 seconds. And then he says, "I think Sam was still in there somewhere, and I think he was learning it too. Let me take that apart, because it is doing 3 things at once, and every one of them is worse than the last. The first thing it does is answer the question. Yes, some part of Samuel Crowder was in there. The boy was not simply gone and replaced. Something of him persisted inside the thing that walked down out of that hollow in December. The second thing it does is explain the, "You better not answer that." If some part of Samuel was in there, then that warning was real. His brother, from inside a thing that was wearing him, told him not to answer the other one. That is the only kindness anybody does for anybody in this entire account, and it came from a boy who had been dead in every way that matters for 2 months. And the third thing, he was learning it too, which means it was not one way. which means that in a house on 80 acres of benchland over the winter of 1907 and 1908, there were two things in that loft copying each other. The thing was learning to be Samuel, and Samuel, or whatever fraction of him was left in there, was learning to be the thing, which means Elias Crowder spent 70 years wondering whether the voice that came down the road behind him for 11 miles, calling him with his mother's humming and his father's laugh, was the thing using his brother, or his brother, using the thing, trying to bring him home. He never resolved it. He said so, plainly. And then he asked the student to turn the machine off, and the student did, and the tape ends there, at 51 minutes and some seconds, mid-breath. There is one more thing on the recording that I want to give you before we go to 1979, because it is 38 seconds long, and it is the reason I take this whole account as seriously as I do. At about the 19-minute mark, the student asks a housekeeping question. He asks Elias to describe the cabin, how big, how it was laid out, where things were, which is the kind of question a folklorist asks to fix a scene. And Elias Crowder describes it. Single pen, log, chimney east, door south, 2 windows, loft, and then he says, without being asked and without any change in his voice, 44 boards in the loft ceiling, 206 rails in the lot fence, 131 steps from the porch to the spring, 22 standing places at the bottom of the pasture, 4 crossings on the creek road, 11 mile to the Cane Ridge Road, 6 numbers, in order, 70 years later. Without a pause between them, then he says, I ain't never got that out of my head, and I quit trying about 1940. Now, the night of the 11th of November, 1979, Elias Crowder was 81 years old. He had lived alone in the same small-frame house on the north side of Harrison since his wife died in 1974. His son lived in Springfield. His daughters were in Harrison, Fayetteville, and Tulsa. One of them called him every evening at 7, which is a detail that matters in a minute. It was a Sunday. It had turned cold that week, the first real cold of the season, down into the 20s overnight, and there had been a hard frost on the ground since Friday. At approximately 11 o'clock at night, somebody knocked on his door. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. I want to give you this the way he gave it, because he did tell this one. He told this one to his son, on the telephone, the next morning, and his son wrote it down within the week, because his son, by that point, had heard the 1977 tape. The family got a copy in 1978, which is its own story, and knew, finally, what his father's whole life had been made of. So we have this one at one remove, and in writing, from a man who had every reason to record it accurately. Elias Crowder was in his chair. The television was on. He got up, and he went to the door. And he did what he had done at every door for 71 years, which was, he did not open it, and he did not speak. He put his hand flat on the wood, and he listened. And a voice on the other side of that door said, "It's cold." Not "It's cold, Daddy," just "It's cold." He said he stood there with his hand on the door, and he was 81 years old, and he was 9 years old, both at once, in the way that happens to people, and the first thing that came into his head was the smell of a creek. And then he did 3 things in order. First, he said out loud, "This ain't Elias." Second, he barred the door. There was a hickory bar. There was a hickory bar in that house in 1979, in Harrison, Arkansas, in a frame house on a street with streetlights, and he had made it himself, and he put it up. Third, he started counting. He counted, out loud, sitting in his chair, facing the door, with the television off and every light in the house on, from 11 o'clock at night until it got light. 7 hours. And here is the detail that I cannot get around, and I have tried. He did not call anybody. There was a telephone in that room. His daughter was 11 minutes away. The Harrison Police Department was 4 minutes away. He was an 81-year-old man who believed something was at his door, and he had a telephone at his elbow, and he did not use it. His son asked him why, and his father's answer, written down at the time, was, "I wasn't going to bring anybody into it. That's how it gets you. Somebody comes over, and then it has got them counted too." 71 years. He had not forgotten one word of what an old woman told him on a bald on Sanders Ridge in February of 1908. A stranger in the room is an item it does not have. And he had spent his whole life understanding the other half of that, which is that the stranger does not stay a stranger. He would not spend anybody, not one person, not even to save himself. He sat in a chair and counted at a door until the sun came up, alone, because being alone was the only version of it where nobody else got added to the list. At first light he went out on the porch. There was frost on the ground and frost on the 2 wooden steps and frost on the concrete walk down to the street. And in the frost on the walk there were bare footprints. They came up from the street. They came up the walk and up the 2 steps and stopped on the porch in front of the door, and there was a place there where the frost was melted out in a ring about a foot across. And they went back. His son asked him, and I think this is the bravest question anybody asks in this entire account, from a 54-year-old man to his father on a telephone, his son asked him whether he had looked at the stride, and Elias Crowder said yes. And his son asked him what it was. And his father said, "Longer going back, 71 years and 8 months after the 13th of December, 1907, when Absalom Crowder came in from following a set of tracks down to the timber and sat at the table and could not eat, and said the strides longer going back. Same thing, same signature, still learning, still not finished. Now, there are explanations. There are always explanations, and I am going to give them, because if I do not give them, then I am not telling you a case. I am selling you something. An 81-year-old man, widowed 5 years, living alone with a lifelong trauma, he had finally spoken aloud for the first time 2 years earlier. Because remember, he had told the story in 1977, and telling a thing after 70 years of silence does not settle it. It could absolutely have had a night terror, a hypnagogic episode, or a straightforward hallucination. Frost is a poor medium. Frost melts unevenly, especially on a concrete walk that has been holding the day's heat. Shapes appear in frost. People see what they are primed to see. And no man in America was ever more primed than that one. And there were children on that street. There were teenagers in Harrison in 1979, and an old man who barred his door and counted out loud all night was exactly the kind of neighbor that teenagers in 1979 noticed. All of that is available. Take as much of it as you need. I mean that sincerely. I will only put one thing next to it. Elias Crowder had been afraid of this specific thing for 71 years and had built his entire life around a set of rules for it, and had never, in 71 years, according to every person who knew him, reported it happening. Not once. Not in the war, not after his mother-in-law died, not when his wife died, not in any of the 10,000 nights when a frightened man's mind would have handed him one for free. The one time he said it happened was the last full year of his life. Elias Crowder died on the 26th of February, 1981. The 26th of February. 73 years to the day from the morning Pearl Denton came around a bend in the fog and found a counting child in the middle of a road. He was 83. The cause on the certificate is heart failure, which at 83 is what it usually is, and there is nothing suspicious in the medical record, and I am not going to invent any. His daughter found him the following afternoon, when he did not answer the 7 o'clock call and did not answer the next morning either. He was in his chair. The chair was facing the door. The door was barred. Now let me tell you what was among his effects, because there were 3 things, and I have saved them, and they are the last 3 things in this account. The first thing was the coat. On the back porch of that house in Harrison, an unheated, unscreened, three-season porch on the north side, there was a peg, and on the peg there was a wool coat, a boy's coat, 12-year-old size. Brown wool, hand-stitched repair at the left elbow, made some time before 1905. Samuel Crowder's coat, the one that hung on the north wall in October, the one that stank of wood smoke in December because a grieving man had hung it by a fire, the one that was hanging in the right place again on the 24th of February, 1908, and the one a 9-year-old grabbed off a post on his way past without remembering he had done it, and wore for 11 miles and 34 hours. He kept it for 73 years, and he hung it on the north wall, in the cold, outside, every house he ever lived in. His mother's rule, kept by her surviving son, alone, for 3/4 of a century, in a house where nobody knew why, for a boy who had been gone since 1907, that is either the most heartbreaking thing in this account or the most frightening, and the honest answer is that I do not think you get to pick. The second thing was in a drawer, and it was a photograph, and I want to handle it responsibly, because photographs are where accounts like this usually go wrong. It is a tintype made in jasper, undated but almost certainly 1905 or 1906. It shows Absalom and Naomi Crowder seated, with 2 boys standing beside them. It is a completely ordinary family photograph. There is nothing wrong with it. There is no extra figure, no smear, no face in a window. I want to say that clearly, because I know what you were expecting, and it is not there, and I am not going to give you a cheap one. What is unusual about the photograph is its condition. The surface is worn, badly worn, in 2 specific places. The tintype is rubbed nearly blank over the faces of the 2 boys. Rubbed by a thumb, over and over, for decades, in exactly the way that a man touches a thing without meaning to. 2 worn places, made by standing in one spot too long, if you are a thing at the bottom of a pasture, or made by a thumb, if you are the brother who got out. The third thing was the account book. It is a cloth-bound ledger, 6 inches by 12, bought new, and the first entry is dated 1923, the year he married. Most of it is exactly what it appears to be. It is a household account: wages, rent, the price of a stove in 1931, doctor bills, 4 children's shoes, 35 years at the Highway Department, recorded in a small, careful hand. It is the ordinary financial record of an ordinary American life, and it is genuinely lovely to read. But there is a second thing in it, and it is on the last page, and it is separate from the accounts entirely. On the last page there is a column of numbers with a date beside each one, 1 entry per year. Every entry made on the 26th of February. They start in 1909, which is 14 years before he bought the book, which means he copied them in from somewhere, which means he had been keeping this list since he was 11 years old on whatever paper an 11-year-old could get. The first entry, 1909, is 73. The next, 1910, is 72. Then 71. Then 70. 1 a year. Down by 1 every year for his entire life. In the hand of a boy, and then a young man, and then an old one, the writing changing across 7 decades, and the arithmetic never once breaking. 1945, 37. 1963, the year he retired. 1974, the year his wife died. 8. 1979, the year of the frost on the walk. 3. 1982, and the last entry in that book, written on the 26th of February, 1981, in a shaking hand, on the day he died. 1. The page after it is blank. Nobody knows what he was counting. His children did not know. His wife had never seen the book. The historical society that eventually received it has no explanation and does not offer one. Every plausible reading has a hole in it. He could not have known in 1909 how long he would live. Nobody knows that. And yet the list runs out on the correct day, at the correct number, with no correction, no crossing out, no adjustment anywhere across 73 entries. He was counting something down, and whatever it was, it got to 1 on the last morning, and he sat down in a chair facing a barred door, and he did not write the next number. I have gone as far as the record goes. That is where it stops. Here is what remains, and it is not much, and I will lay it out plain. There is a hollow in the southeast quarter of Newton County, Arkansas, that a survey crew marked not run in 1888. There is a family that stops appearing in the tax rolls in 1871, and a ledger they left in a spring house that ends in the middle of a sentence. There is a sheriff's daybook with the words, "I do not know what to write here" in it. There are 2 acres of old-growth white oak that a timber company went around. There is a schoolteacher's letter asking how a boy could have seen her from that side of the room. And there is 51 minutes of a 79-year-old man's voice on a reel of tape, giving 6 numbers in order without pausing between them. And there is a coat on a north wall, in the cold, hung upright for 73 years, by the only person who ever walked up out of that account, still counting. One last note on sourcing, and then I will let you go. I have tried throughout this to keep the line visible between what is documented and what is testimony, because in a case like this, the line is the only thing of value I have to offer you. The documents are the survey plat with "not run" penciled beside a drainage, the tax rolls that stop, the ledger from the spring house, 4 photographed pages of a sheriff's daybook, 4 letters from a schoolteacher to her sister, a timber company map with 2 acres left uncut, a weather record, a death certificate, and a household account book with a column of numbers running down the last page. The testimony is one man talking for 51 minutes at the age of 79 about the winter he was 9. Everything frightening in this account lives in the second category. I want you to know that I know that. A tape is not a proof. Memory rebuilds itself every time it is used, and a memory used every night for 70 years is a memory that has been rebuilt more than most. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, and it is not an argument, it is just a fact about the shape of the evidence. The documents were not available to him. He never read Mahala Corbin's ledger. He never saw Hask's daybook. He certainly never read Ora Bellamy's private letters to her sister in Fayetteville. He died in 1981, and the Bellamy letters were not donated until 1984, and nobody put any of these things beside his voice until well into this century. And when they were finally laid side by side, they agreed. On the clean feet, on the standing places, on the wrong side of the creek, on a phrase about thick ground and thin ground, given by 2 women 31 miles and 60 years apart. That is what I have. It is not proof, and I will not dress it up as proof. It is only that 4 separate people, who could not have compared notes, wrote down the same small details about the same 2 acres of Newton County, Arkansas, across 111 years. So, I asked you at the start whether you had ever heard somebody say a name and known, before you could explain it to yourself, that the name did not belong to the person it was landing on. Here is the question I will leave you with instead. If something spent a winter at your table, if it ate your food and said grace and learned your habits one small correction at a time, and if the only reason it had not finished was that some part of you was doing something on the inside that it could not see, how would you know which part that was? And would you be able to keep doing it, out loud, alone, in the dark, for 73 years, without ever once explaining to anybody why? Because Elias Crowder did. Tell me in the comments if you have got a habit like that. Not a story, a habit. The thing you do at night that you have never explained to anybody, the light you leave on, the door you check twice, the number you get to before you can sleep. I want to read those more than I want to read anything else, and I read all of them. If this is the kind of case you want 10 of, What the Hollows Keep is linked below, and pinned at the top of the comments. 10 cases, 9 hours, 5 states, the same dark, and next time we are going north. 1894. A logging camp in the Upper Peninsula. 41 men, 1 winter, and a cook who kept account of the plates and found, in January, that he was setting one too many and kept setting it anyway, for 11 weeks, because of what happened the one night he did not. Until then, keep your account, hang your coat where it belongs, and sleep with the door barred.